Hello, Midnight Wanderers, and welcome to Netheric Horror. This is where ancient whispers rise beneath a crimson sky, carrying you softly into the world of dreams and shadows. Before tonight's haunting story begins, tell me, what corner of the world are you listening from? Drop it in the comments. And if the silence of the night calls to you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you'll never miss the moon's next dark secret. This particular experience happened only a couple of weeks ago at this point, specifically on the night of October 18th. My significant other and I had just landed in Tokyo following a fairly late flight originating from Hong Kong. Once we arrived, we made our way to our hotel located in the Iidabashi area of the city and went through the check-in process. By that point, it was already around 3 in the morning, and both of us were completely exhausted from the travel, more than ready to simply collapse into bed and fall asleep as quickly as possible. When we finally stepped into our hotel room, my initial impression of the space was that it felt unusually tiny and in some way that is difficult to fully articulate, almost suffocating. Despite that immediate impression, I was far too exhausted at that point to give the feeling much additional thought, and my only real priority in that moment was simply getting into bed and falling asleep as quickly as possible after such a long, tiring day of travel. My significant other, however, was clearly not pleased with the room at all, and he began voicing his complaints almost immediately after we settled in. As we both attempted to get ready for bed and eventually lay down to try to sleep, he started pacing back and forth around the room instead of settling down, and as the minutes passed, his pacing became increasingly frantic and agitated. He told me directly that it felt completely impossible for him to fall asleep in that particular room, no matter how exhausted he clearly was from the long flight and the late hour. At the time, I did not feel particularly concerned about his restlessness, chalking it up to simple travel exhaustion, combined with general dissatisfaction about the size and feel of the room itself. I ended up dozing off myself fairly quickly, despite his continued pacing, only to wake up again roughly half an hour later, startled awake by an intensely disturbing image that had appeared within my dream. A horrifying face suddenly showing up right in front of my own face within that dream state, jolting me awake almost immediately afterward. Once I was fully awake, I looked around the room and saw that my significant other was indeed still pacing around exactly as he had been before I had fallen asleep, clearly no closer to settling down or finding any rest for himself. Seeing him still in that same agitated state, I realized I needed to actually do something to help address whatever was going on, rather than simply letting the situation continue as it had been. At that point, I became aware of a distinct presence in the room. The same presence I believed was responsible for having woken me up so abruptly from my dream. I could sense this presence, actively rummaging through the room in a way that felt deeply disturbing and disruptive, almost as though it were running around frantically, making a mess of the space, possibly reacting with some kind of anger or agitation toward the fact that we had entered and were now occupying that particular room. I asked my significant other to come join me in bed, and as he did, I mentally pictured, or imagined, throwing a kind of protective blanket or shield directly over him. An internal, visualized action meant to create some sense of protection or separation between him and whatever presence I was sensing in the room around us. After roughly 10 minutes of maintaining this mental visualization, I could sense that he had finally managed to drift off to sleep. However, I found myself struggling considerably to maintain this protective energy, or whatever exactly it was I was doing, because every single time I came close to falling asleep myself, the mental shield I had been picturing would seem to drop away, leaving that protective barrier compromised. Given this ongoing difficulty, I eventually made the decision that I needed to directly address whatever this presence or energy actually was, rather than simply trying to shield against it indefinitely. When I say that I decided to speak to it, what I specifically mean is that I mentally imagined having a conversation with this energy inside my own head, a kind of internal visualized dialogue, and somehow, through that process, actual changes seemed to occur within the room itself. I want to clarify that I have engaged in this kind of internal, imagined communication on several other occasions throughout my life, though I have honestly never fully believed in the reality or significance of any of it before this particular experience. In the past, I had generally dismissed these kinds of internal conversations as simply a personal technique for calming down my own imagination or managing anxiety, rather than viewing them as any kind of genuine communication with an external presence or energy. Attempting to reach out and contact whatever this presence was proved somewhat difficult at first, given how actively it seemed to be moving around the room during that time. But eventually, after enough focused effort, I managed to get its attention. The moment I succeeded in doing so, the face or energy that had originally startled me awake from my dream suddenly transformed into the image of a young girl, who then sat down in the corner of the room, crying quietly to herself. Seeing this transformation, I tried to offer her comfort in whatever way I could, mentally communicating to her that I was there with her, present and aware of whatever she might be experiencing or feeling. After sitting with her in that state for a little while, she eventually looked up toward me, offering a smile that felt both sweet and deeply sad at the same time. And then she simply disappeared entirely from view. At the exact same moment that she disappeared, a small ball of bright light appeared, floating in the air within the room. This ball of light remained suspended there for just a moment before suddenly exploding outward, expanding rapidly until it seemed to encompass the entire room around us. Following that burst of light, the room itself appeared to transform completely. What had previously felt small, cramped, and deeply uncomfortable now felt bright, noticeably larger, and genuinely warm and homely in a way it had not felt at all when we had first checked in earlier that night. The next morning, when we both woke up, I had already mentally filed away everything I had experienced the night before as something I had simply imagined, likely brought on by exhaustion and the disorientation of jet lag following such a long, late flight. However, almost immediately upon waking, the very first thing my significant other asked me was what exactly I had done to the room overnight. He specifically wanted to know how I had managed to get rid of what he described as that crazy energy that had been present in the room earlier. Hearing him bring this up unprompted, without any suggestion or prior discussion from me, revealed something important. It turned out that he had experienced the exact same presence and the exact same unsettling energy that I had sensed myself throughout that night. Though, unlike me, he had not known how to actively address or deal with whatever it was he had been sensing and reacting to through his restless, frantic pacing. Over the following days of our trip, he thanked me on several separate occasions for whatever it was I had apparently done to resolve the situation within that room, even though he continued to maintain, throughout all of this, that he personally does not believe in anything supernatural or paranormal in nature. Despite that stated skepticism, his own experience that night, and his repeated acknowledgement of what had changed within the room afterward, seemed to suggest some kind of genuine shared perception between the two of us regarding what had actually happened, regardless of how either of us might choose to intellectually categorize or explain it afterward. Honestly, I still do not fully know what to make of the entire experience myself, even now, a couple of weeks removed from that particular night. Part of me remains inclined to view it through a more grounded psychological lens, recognizing that both of us were extremely exhausted after a long day of travel, dealing with an unfamiliar environment and potentially more susceptible to unusual perceptions or shared anxieties as a result of that combined exhaustion and disorientation. But another part of me finds it difficult to fully dismiss everything that happened, especially given how specifically and independently my significant other described experiencing that same unsettling energy himself, without any prior suggestion or discussion from me about what I had personally been sensing or attempting to address throughout the night. For the remainder of our trip after that particular night, we genuinely enjoyed staying in that same hotel room, finding it comfortable and welcoming for the rest of our time in Tokyo. A noticeable shift compared to how uncomfortable and unsettling it had initially felt to both of us upon first checking in. We ended up having a wonderful vacation overall, with that one strange. Difficult night standing out as an isolated experience rather than something that continued to affect the rest of our stay in any negative way. Reflecting further on everything that happened that night, I find myself continuing to turn over various pieces of the experience in my mind, trying to make sense of it from multiple different angles. The specific detail of my significant other independently describing the exact same unsettling energy the following morning, without any leading questions or suggestions from me beforehand, remains the piece of this entire experience that I find hardest to simply explain away as pure imagination or coincidence. If I alone had experienced everything that happened that night, the frightening face appearing within my dream, the sense of a presence rummaging through the room, the eventual transformation into a crying girl, and the final burst of light that seemed to shift the entire atmosphere of the room, I might be more inclined now to view the whole experience as simply an unusually vivid product of exhaustion and travel-related stress. But given that my significant other, someone who openly maintains he does not believe in anything supernatural, independently experienced enough of that same unsettling energy to specifically ask me the following morning what I had done to address and resolve it, makes the entire situation feel considerably more significant and difficult to dismiss. I have also found myself thinking about the specific imagery involved in what I experienced, particularly the transformation from that initial frightening, disturbing face into the image of a young girl sitting alone in the corner of the room, crying. There was something about that specific transformation that felt meaningful in a way I still find difficult to fully articulate. Almost as though whatever initial energy or presence I had sensed within the room needed to be approached and understood differently than my first instinct of fear and protection had assumed. Rather than remaining purely hostile or threatening throughout the entire encounter, it shifted, at least within my own perception and internal visualization, into something that felt more like sadness or unresolved grief. Something that responded not to continued resistance or protective shielding, but rather to a simple offer of presence and comfort. I do not know whether I will ever fully understand or explain what actually happened in that hotel room during those early morning hours in Tokyo. I remain genuinely uncertain about how much weight to give my own internal experience, especially given my own long-standing skepticism about these kinds of internal imagined conversations I have occasionally engaged in throughout my life without ever previously believing they held any real, external significance. But the specific, independent corroboration from my significant other the following morning continues to stand out as the detail I find hardest to simply set aside or dismiss entirely. Whatever the true explanation for that night ultimately is, whether rooted in some kind of genuine supernatural experience, some shared psychological phenomenon brought on by exhaustion and unfamiliar surroundings, or some combination of both, it remains one of the strangest and most memorable experiences from our recent trip to Tokyo. One that neither my significant other nor I have been able to fully explain away in the time since it happened, despite his continued insistence that he does not personally believe in anything supernatural at all. My grandmother passed away when I was 17 years old, and the entire day surrounding her passing has stayed with me vividly ever since. Partly because of the ordinary way the day started, and partly because of something strange that happened to me personally while it was all unfolding. On the actual day she passed, my parents had left my brother and me at home while they went to visit her at the hospital. That same day turned out to be the day they were faced with the difficult decision of switching off her life support. Something I did not know was happening in real time while it was actually taking place. While all of this was happening at the hospital, my brother was sitting in the lounge at home, completely absorbed in watching Cartoon Network the way any normal kid his age might spend an ordinary afternoon. I was in a different part of the house, sitting in the dining room, playing a video game called Tibia on the computer. The layout of the house was such that if I leaned back slightly in my chair while sitting at the computer, I actually had a clear line of sight into the lounge where my brother was sitting, watching his show. I do not remember the exact time this next part happened, only that it must have been sometime after lunch that day, based on how the rest of the afternoon unfolded. While I was sitting there at the computer playing my game, I suddenly heard a voice, clearly speaking my name, followed by the words, "It's okay now." Along with hearing this, I became distinctly aware of a strong smell, one that immediately reminded me of a hospital. That particular sterile, clinical scent that is difficult to mistake for anything else once you have experienced it. At the exact same moment, I felt a sudden, noticeable chill pass through my entire body, a coldness that lasted for a few seconds, before gradually fading away. I immediately turned to check on my brother, curious whether he had experienced anything similar, but when I asked him about it, he told me he had not heard or noticed anything at all, still fully absorbed in whatever cartoon he had been watching in the lounge. Whatever I had just experienced, the voice, the hospital smell, and the sudden cold sensation appeared to have been something only I had perceived in that moment. My parents did not arrive back home until around 3 in the afternoon that day. Once they returned, I explained to them exactly what had happened to me earlier, describing the voice saying my name along with the reassurance that everything was okay now, the distinct hospital smell that had accompanied it, and the brief but noticeable chill that had passed through me at the same time. Hearing my account, my parents told me something that immediately gave the entire experience a much heavier significance than I had initially assigned to it. They explained that my grandmother had passed away at almost exactly the same time that I had experienced that strange sensation at home, meaning the timing of what I felt lined up closely, if not precisely, with the actual moment of her death at the hospital. Learning that piece of information changed how I thought about the entire experience from that point forward. What had initially felt like a strange, unexplainable moment I could not fully account for suddenly took on a much more significant meaning, given how closely it seemed to correspond with the actual timing of her passing. I have thought about that specific afternoon many times over the years since it happened, always circling back to the same unanswered question of how I could have experienced such a specific combination of sensations. Hearing my name spoken directly along with words of comfort, smelling something so distinctly tied to a hospital environment despite being nowhere near one myself, and feeling that sudden physical chill, all occurring at what turned out to be essentially the exact moment my grandmother passed away in a completely different location. I do not have any solid, rational explanation for what actually happened to me that day. I was not asleep, was not daydreaming or distracted in any significant way beyond the normal, casual attention someone gives to playing a video game. The voice I heard felt distinct and clear, not the kind of vague, half-formed thought or auditory illusion you might expect from simple daydreaming or distraction. And the specific combination of sensory details, particularly that hospital smell appearing so suddenly and clearly in a location with absolutely no logical connection to any actual hospital, remains one of the hardest parts of the entire experience to explain away using any conventional reasoning. This was not the only strange, unexplainable experience I have had over the years, though. Sometime later, I went through another incident that has similarly stuck with me, remaining just as vivid and unsettling in my memory as that afternoon when my grandmother passed. This second experience happened not long after the funeral of my children's great-grandfather, a family member whose passing had understandably affected the broader family during that period. One night, during the early hours of the morning, I woke up suddenly from sleep, and as my eyes adjusted to the darkness of the room, I found myself looking directly at an elderly man standing at the end of my bed. I did not recognize him immediately, and the shock and fear of waking up to find an unfamiliar figure standing there in my room in the middle of the night hit me instantly and overwhelmingly. I screamed out loud, a sudden, involuntary reaction driven purely by fear and shock at what I was seeing. My scream immediately woke up my partner at the time, who is now my ex-partner, startling him awake beside me in the same bed. By the time he had fully woken up and turned to see what was happening, the elderly man who had been standing at the end of the bed only moments earlier was completely gone. There was no trace of him anywhere in the room, no indication of how he could have left so quickly and so silently in the brief span of time between my scream and my partner waking up and looking toward where I had been staring. Given the timing of this experience, occurring not long after we had all attended the funeral for my children's great-grandfather, I have often wondered whether there was some connection between his recent passing and the sudden appearance of this elderly man at the end of my bed that night. I did not get a long enough or clear enough look at him to say with certainty whether he actually resembled my children's great-grandfather specifically, given how quickly the entire encounter unfolded and how immediately my fear response took over once I registered his presence there in the darkness. But the timing alone, happening so soon after a death within the family, has always felt significant to me, difficult to simply write off as pure coincidence. Looking back on both of these experiences together, separated by a number of years, but connected by that same underlying thread of unexplainable sensory experiences occurring around the deaths of close family members, I find myself continuing to sit with a mixture of uncertainty and quiet conviction about what actually happened in each instance. With my grandmother's passing, I had clear corroborating information from my parents afterward, confirming that the timing of what I experienced lined up closely with the actual moment of her death. Information I had no way of knowing or predicting beforehand, since I was simply sitting at home, playing a video game, with no direct knowledge of what was happening at the hospital in that specific moment. With the second experience involving the elderly man appearing at the end of my bed, I do not have quite the same level of external corroboration, since my partner at the time did not actually see the figure himself, only witnessing the immediate aftermath of my scream and my own visible shock and fear once he woke up. Still, the specific timing of that experience, occurring so soon after the funeral of a close family member, combined with the vivid, undeniable clarity of what I saw in that moment before it vanished, has kept that memory just as firmly lodged in my mind as the earlier experience surrounding my grandmother's passing. I have thought, over the years, about whether these two experiences might be connected in some broader way, whether I might simply be more sensitive or receptive in some fashion to experiences occurring around the deaths of family members specifically, given that both of these unexplainable incidents happen to align so closely with significant losses within my own family. I do not have any concrete answer to that question, and I recognize that it is entirely possible these two experiences are simply unrelated, isolated incidents that happen to share a loose thematic connection without any deeper underlying explanation tying them together beyond that surface level similarity. What I do know, with complete certainty, is that both experiences felt entirely real to me as they were happening, not vague or dreamlike in the way you might expect from simple imagination or half-remembered impressions formed after the fact. The moment involving my grandmother came with such specific, layered sensory detail, the clear voice speaking my name, the distinct hospital smell, and the physical sensation of sudden cold, that it does not fit neatly into any explanation involving simple distraction or imagination on my part, especially once confirmed against the actual timing of her passing as reported by my parents afterward. Similarly, the elderly man standing at the end of my bed was not some fleeting, ambiguous shape glimpsed briefly in low light that I could easily talk myself into believing had simply been a trick of shadow or half-asleep confusion. He was clearly visible, distinctly present, and then, within the span of just a few seconds, completely and inexplicably gone. I do not know whether either of these experiences reflects some kind of genuine supernatural occurrence, some deeper connection between myself and family members going through significant life transitions like death, or whether there is some other explanation entirely that I simply have not been able to identify in all the time I have spent thinking about both incidents since they happened. What I can say is that both experiences remain firmly and vividly present in my memory, each one tied closely to a significant loss within my family, each one carrying its own distinct, unsettling clarity that has never faded or blurred with time the way so many other, more ordinary memories tend to do. Whenever I think back on either of these moments, whether the afternoon my grandmother passed away or that night not long after my children's great-grandfather's funeral, I find myself returning to the same unanswered questions, still searching, even now, for some kind of explanation that might finally help me make full sense of what I actually experienced on both of those occasions. I think one of the most frightened I have ever been was the night I returned to my ground floor apartment after a party and slowly realized that someone had broken into my home. The worst part was not noticing the missing things. It was understanding that the person might still have been somewhere inside with me. Looking back, this may have been only the second most frightening thing I have experienced, but the other event is a much longer story. At first, I did not have the energy to describe that one. The strange thing is that I also thought this story would be short, yet once I started remembering the details, more and more of that night came back to me. At the time, I lived alone in a very small ground floor apartment. When I say small, I mean there were not many rooms and there were very few places where a person could hide. There was a living area, a bedroom, a kitchen, a bathroom, a couple of closets, and a tiny porch at the back. The neighborhood was not known for much crime. It was not the kind of area where people constantly worried about burglaries. I locked my doors, but I never felt the need to check every window before sleeping or search the apartment when I came home. My apartment had a strange back entrance. There was a narrow window beside the back door. The window was only about a foot wide. It looked much too small for anyone to climb through, so I had never thought of it as a serious security problem. Outside the window and back door was a tiny screened porch. The porch was not large enough to be useful for much, but it created a small barrier between the apartment and the outside. The back door had a double-sided deadbolt. That meant it needed a key from both sides. Someone standing inside could not simply turn a knob to unlock it. They had to use the key. I kept the keys inside the apartment. not far from the door. At the time, that did not seem dangerous. I believed nobody could enter through the tiny window. If someone could not get inside, they could not reach the keys. There was also another problem with the lock. It was old and sticky. It did not open in the normal way. To unlock it, I had to insert the key, begin turning it, then pull it out a tiny amount at exactly the right moment. If I pushed the key completely into the lock and turned normally, it would stick. I had used the lock so many times that the movement had become automatic. I could open it without thinking. My hand knew exactly when to pull the key back. Anyone who had never used that lock before would probably believe it was broken. That small problem may have prevented the thief from taking almost everything I owned. On the night this happened, I had gone to a party. I had been drinking, although I do not remember exactly how much. I was not completely out of control, but I had definitely consumed alcohol shortly before returning home. It must have been around 1 in the morning when I got back, maybe even later. I entered the apartment through the front door. Nothing immediately looked wrong. The front door had been secure. There was no broken glass in the living room. Furniture had not been overturned, and the apartment was not obviously destroyed. I turned on the lights and walked inside as I normally did. Because the place was so small, I never imagined someone could be hiding there without me noticing. I did not check behind doors or open closets. I did not look under the bed. I simply assumed I was alone. I had been at a loud party, and although it was late, I was not ready to sleep. My body was tired, but my mind was still active. The apartment felt almost too quiet after being around music and people. I changed clothes and moved around the apartment trying to decide what to do. For some reason, I remembered a bag of psilocybin mushrooms that I had stored in my freezer. They were old, and I had been saving them for some future occasion with friends. I had used hallucinogens a few times before, but I had never taken them alone. Taking mushrooms by myself after drinking at a party was not something I had planned. Even now, I do not know why I decided to do it. Maybe I was bored. Maybe the alcohol had affected my judgment. Maybe I did not want the night to end yet. Whatever the reason, I took the bag out of the freezer and chewed a few stems. Almost immediately afterward, I walked into the kitchen and noticed something that seemed slightly wrong. The key for the back door deadbolt was lying on the counter beside the sink. I stared at it for a moment. That was not where I kept it. I had a regular place for the key, and the counter by the sink was not that place. I tried to remember whether I had moved it earlier. Because I had been drinking, I questioned my own memory. Maybe I had used the back door and forgotten to return the key. Maybe I had left it there before going to the party. The key alone was not enough to frighten me, but it created an uncomfortable feeling. I picked it up and looked toward the back door. That was when I noticed the window beside it. The narrow window was open. I knew I had not left it open. The apartment suddenly felt different. A few seconds earlier, it had felt quiet and familiar. Now it seemed as if every corner held something I had not noticed. I moved closer to the window and looked outside. The screen around the tiny porch had been damaged. Someone had punched or cut a hole through it. That was when I began to understand. The open window was not an accident. The key had not moved by itself. Someone had entered my apartment. The realization came slowly because my mind kept trying to reject it. I looked around the kitchen, then the rest of the apartment. At first, nothing obvious seemed missing. Then I noticed that some rolled coins were gone. I had been collecting them and planned to take them to the bank. A pair of binoculars was also missing. They were not extremely valuable, but someone had clearly searched the apartment and taken whatever small items they could carry. Then I realized my school backpack was gone too. The thief had apparently used my own backpack to carry the stolen property. That detail made the whole situation feel even more personal. The person had entered my home, handled my belongings, found a bag I used regularly, filled it with my possessions, and taken it away. It was not a large robbery. The thief had not taken furniture or expensive electronics, but only because they could not easily remove large objects through the narrow window. I stood in the apartment trying to reconstruct what had happened. The intruder had first reached the small back porch. They had punched a hole through its screen. Then they somehow squeezed their body through a window only about a foot wide. I still do not understand how they managed it. They must have been thin, small, flexible, or extremely determined. Once inside, they searched the apartment. They found the rolled coins and binoculars. They found my backpack and placed the stolen items inside. Then they tried to leave. The front door would have been the easiest exit, but it probably felt too risky. The apartment opened toward areas where a neighbor or another person might see them. The back door offered more privacy. The thief had found the key and brought it to the back door. But they could not open the lock. They did not know the small trick of pulling the key out slightly while turning it. They probably pushed it in all the way and tried to force it. The lock would have refused to move. They may have tried several times. Eventually, they must have given up. That explained why the key was lying on the counter. The thief had been forced to leave through the same narrow window they had used to enter. Climbing out must have been difficult, especially while carrying my backpack. That was the explanation I formed at first. Then a much more frightening thought entered my mind. What if the thief had still been inside when I came home? Perhaps they had been trying to open the back door when they heard my key in the front lock. Maybe they dropped the deadbolt key on the counter, grabbed the backpack, and hid. When I entered, they could not safely leave through the front because they would have to pass directly by me. The back door still would not open. That would leave only the narrow window. Maybe they waited for me to move into another room before slipping out. Or maybe they had not left yet. I looked around the apartment again. It was very small, but there were still places where someone could hide. There were closets. There was the shower curtain. There was space behind doors and beside furniture. I could not remember exactly where I had walked after entering the apartment. Had I gone into the bedroom to change? Had I passed the closet without looking inside? Had I stood with my back toward the living room? The possibility that someone had watched me from only a few feet away made my skin crawl. I listened carefully. The apartment was silent. I did not hear breathing, footsteps, or movement. But a person trying to avoid discovery would also be silent. I wanted to check every room, but I did not want to discover anyone. That is a strange feeling. You need to know whether someone is inside, yet you are terrified of finding the answer. Then I remembered what I had just eaten. The mushrooms had not affected me yet, but they would probably begin working soon. I had also been drinking within the last hour. Now I was alone in an apartment that had been burglarized, wondering whether an intruder was hiding somewhere, while waiting for a hallucinogenic drug to take effect. It was almost the worst possible timing. I began imagining what would happen when the police arrived. Would they realize I had been drinking? Would the mushrooms start affecting me while I was speaking with them? Would they think I had imagined the break-in? The broken screen, open window, moved key, and missing items were real. But I worried that my condition would make me appear unreliable. Still, I could not safely search the apartment by myself. I finally called the police. I told them I had returned home and discovered that someone had broken in. I explained that the back window was open and property was missing. I do not remember whether I immediately admitted I had eaten the mushrooms. I may have avoided mentioning that unless it became necessary. The important thing was getting someone there to make sure the intruder was gone. The police arrived and came inside. They walked through the apartment with me. Because the place was so small, the search did not take long, but they checked it carefully. They looked in the bedroom, closets, bathroom, and back area. Nobody was hiding inside. Whoever had broken in was gone. That confirmation allowed me to breathe again. The officers examined the damaged porch screen and the narrow window. They saw the signs of entry and understood how the thief had probably reached the apartment. They also looked at the back door and the key. The evidence made it clear that the burglary had really happened. I had not imagined it because of alcohol or mushrooms. I was relieved that the police believed me, but I still felt exposed and uncomfortable. My apartment no longer felt private. A stranger had been inside it. They had touched my things, searched for valuables, and probably walked through every room. They knew the layout of my home. They may have looked at personal papers, clothes, photographs, or other objects that were not worth stealing. That is one of the worst parts of a burglary. The physical items can often be replaced. The feeling of being safe inside your own home is much harder to recover. I kept thinking about the thief's failed attempt to open the back door. If the lock had worked normally, the person could have taken much more. The narrow window limited the size of anything they could remove. A television could not fit through it. Other large items would have been impossible to carry out. But an open door would have changed everything. The thief could have taken my television, electronics, and anything else they wanted. The faulty lock, which had always irritated me, had accidentally protected my property. It also made me wonder how long the thief had spent trying to open it. They may have stood in the kitchen only minutes before I arrived, turning the key over and over. Perhaps the lock was still being tested while I approached the building. Maybe they heard my footsteps or the sound of my key in the front door. That would explain why the deadbolt key was left beside the sink rather than returned to its usual place. The thought that I may have interrupted the burglary became harder to ignore. I tried to remember whether anything unusual had happened when I entered. Had I heard a small noise near the back? Had the curtains moved? Had there been a faint sound from the porch? Because I had been drinking and was not paying close attention, I could not trust my memory. It was possible the thief escaped only seconds before I reached the kitchen. It was also possible they hid as I entered, then climbed out while I changed clothes or opened the freezer. That idea still frightens me. While I was chewing those mushroom stems, thinking I was alone, someone might have been squeezing through the back window with my backpack. If I had looked toward the window a little earlier, we could have come face to face. I do not know what the thief would have done. Maybe they would have dropped the bag and run. Maybe they would have tried to push past me. Maybe they carried a knife or another weapon. People who are caught during burglaries can become violent, especially if they believe they will be identified. I was lucky that no confrontation happened. The police completed their search and took the report. There was not much information I could give them because I had not seen the thief. I did not know whether it was a man or woman. I did not know how many people were involved. There were no security cameras, and I had no description of a vehicle. The stolen items were small and common. Rolled coins could be spent or exchanged anywhere. The binoculars and backpack could easily disappear. I never found out who had entered the apartment. After the police left, I remained there alone. By then, I was still worried about the mushrooms beginning to affect me. Fear and adrenaline had taken control of my mind, though, and I do not remember experiencing a strong hallucination. Perhaps the mushrooms were too old. Maybe I had taken too little. Or maybe the stress of the burglary overwhelmed everything else. I checked the doors and windows repeatedly. Even though the police had confirmed the apartment was empty, I found myself looking into the closets again. I knew logically that nobody was there. Emotionally, I no longer trusted the space. Every shadow looked suspicious. Every sound from the building made me pause. Ground floor apartments already have a certain vulnerability because the windows and doors are easy to reach from outside. Before that night, I had not really thought about it. Afterward, I could not stop thinking about it. The narrow window, which had always seemed harmless, had allowed a person to enter. The porch screen, which looked like a barrier, had been broken with almost no effort. The key, which I had kept close to the door for convenience, had almost allowed the thief to open a full-sized exit. I changed the way I secured the apartment after that. I no longer kept the key in such an easy place. I made sure the narrow window was properly locked. I became more careful when returning home late. Before relaxing, I checked the rooms. Sometimes I opened closets, even though I knew it was probably unnecessary. The fears stayed with me because the story had no clear answer. I knew someone had entered. I knew what they had taken. I knew how they had probably escaped. But I did not know when they left. That missing part mattered. If the thief escaped before I came home, the experience was a burglary. If they were still inside when I entered, it was something much more dangerous. The difference could have been only a few seconds. I often pictured the thief standing in the kitchen, struggling with a sticky lock. Then they heard the front door. They froze. They placed or dropped the key beside the sink. They grabbed my backpack and looked for somewhere to hide. Perhaps I entered as they moved toward the bedroom. Maybe I walked past the living room while they crouched behind something. Maybe they watched me take the mushrooms from the freezer. Then, when my back was turned, they climbed through the narrow window and disappeared. I will never know whether that happened. It is possible the apartment had been empty for hours before I returned. The thief may have broken in earlier in the evening, taken the small items, and calmly left. That is the most comforting explanation. Unfortunately, comfort is not proof. The moved key suggested the person had been working near the back door. The open window meant their exit route was obvious. The fact that I did not immediately notice anything allowed my imagination to fill in the missing timeline. Even years later, that possibility remains the part that disturbs me most. The story sometimes sounds funny when I tell it now. I came home drunk from a party, decided to eat old mushrooms by myself, and then had to call the police because my apartment had been robbed. It sounds like the beginning of a dark comedy. At the time, there was nothing funny about it. I was standing inside a small apartment at 1 a.m, waiting for hallucinogens to affect me, while wondering whether a stranger was hiding behind one of the doors. I knew the person had already entered my private space. I did not know whether they were still close enough to attack me. That feeling is difficult to describe. Your home is supposed to separate you from the dangers outside. Once a stranger crosses that boundary, walls and locks stop feeling as strong as they did before. The thief did not steal anything irreplaceable. I lost rolled coins, binoculars, and my school backpack. My television remained because the window was too narrow and the sticky lock refused to open. In terms of money, it could have been much worse. But the emotional effect had nothing to do with the value of the stolen things. What stayed with me was the image of someone forcing their body through that tiny window. I imagined them landing quietly inside the apartment. I imagined them moving through my rooms while I was at the party. I imagined them opening drawers, touching my possessions, and deciding what to take. Then I imagined them hearing me come home. Maybe the thief had already gone. Maybe they were only a few feet away. The police found nobody, and I was safe. But the question never completely left me. Whenever I came home afterward, I looked toward the back of the apartment before doing anything else. I checked the key. I checked the window. I listened for movement. Most nights, everything was normal. Still, I never again believed that the small window was too narrow for a person. Someone had climbed through it once. They could have done it again. The only things that protected me that night may have been a faulty lock and a few minutes of timing. I was about 5 years old when this happened at my grandmother's house. I do not remember every small detail from that day, but the important parts have stayed with me for years. Some memories from childhood become blurry over time. This one did not. I still remember the knock at the door, the gunshots, and the body outside. My grandmother's house always felt safe to me. It was one of those places where I never expected anything bad to happen. I was young, surrounded by family, and I believed that being inside her home meant nothing dangerous could reach us. My brother was there with me that day. I do not remember exactly what we were doing before the knock came. We may have been watching television, playing, or simply sitting around the house. It was an ordinary day until someone came to the front door. There was a knock. At first, nobody reacted as if anything was wrong. People knock on doors all the time. It could have been a neighbor, someone delivering something, or a person looking for directions. My brother went to answer it. He opened the door, but almost immediately, he closed it again. The person standing outside was a man none of us recognized. He was not a family member, a friend, or someone from the neighborhood that we knew. My brother must have felt uneasy the moment he saw him, because he did not continue the conversation. He did not invite the man inside or leave the door open long enough for him to explain why he was there. He simply shut the door. That reaction frightened us a little, but only for a moment. We asked who the man was, but my brother said he did not know. None of the adults recognized him either. We thought maybe he had come to the wrong house or was looking for somebody who lived nearby. The man had not tried to force the door open. He had not shouted or threatened anyone. Because of that, we tried not to think too much about him. Still, I remember that his visit left a strange feeling in the house. Even at 5 years old, I understood that my brother had closed the door quickly because something about the man did not feel right. A little while later, we heard gunshots. The sound was sudden and loud. I do not remember exactly how many shots there were, but I remember the sharp cracking noises from outside. They were close enough that everyone in the house immediately understood there was danger nearby. I had already been taught what to do if I ever heard gunfire. I crouched down and moved away from the windows. The adults told us to stay low and not look outside. Their voices sounded serious and urgent. That frightened me even more than the gunshots. Children understand fear in the adults around them. Even when nobody explains what is happening, a child can hear it in the way people speak and move. I stayed down and waited. I did not know whether someone was shooting at the house. I did not know if the stranger from the door had returned or whether somebody else was involved. My imagination began creating terrible possibilities. I wondered whether the man was trying to get inside. I wondered whether bullets could come through the walls or windows. I wondered whether the police were outside. The gunshots stopped, but the silence afterward felt heavy. Nobody knew whether it was safe to move yet. I stayed away from the windows as I had been told. At least I did for a while. After some time passed and no more shots were fired, my fear slowly turned into curiosity. I wanted to know what had happened. Children are often told not to look at frightening things, but sometimes that warning makes them want to look even more. I needed to understand what was outside. I moved carefully toward a window. I knew I was not supposed to go near it, but the dangers seemed to have passed. I looked outside. There were police officers in the area. Then I saw a man lying on the ground. A police officer was standing over him and searching his body. The man did not move. At first, I did not fully understand what I was seeing. I knew the man was hurt, but it took a moment for me to understand that he was dead. Then, I recognized him. He was the same man who had knocked on my grandmother's door. Only a short time earlier, he had been standing alive outside the house. My brother had looked at him and closed the door. Now, he was lying dead outside while a police officer searched him. That image stayed with me. I was too young to understand the full situation. I did not know what had happened before the man came to our house. I did not know why the police were looking for him, or why an officer had shot him. I only knew that the stranger from the door was dead. I moved away from the window, but I could not remove the image from my mind. The man had been alive only minutes earlier. He had stood close enough for my brother to see his face. Then we heard gunshots. Now he was lying on the ground. That was probably the first time I truly understood how quickly someone could die. Before that day, death was something connected to old people, illness, hospitals, and funerals. It was something adults spoke about quietly. What I saw was different. It was sudden. There was no warning, no long goodbye, and no time to prepare. One moment, a man was standing at a door. The next time I saw him, he was dead. I do not remember exactly what my grandmother or the other adults told me afterward. They probably tried to keep the explanation simple because I was so young. They may have told me the man had been dangerous or that the police had been trying to stop him. I do not remember being given the full story. For years, I wondered why he had knocked on our door. Was he trying to hide from the police? Did he want someone to let him inside? Was he looking for help? Did he choose my grandmother's house at random? Maybe he had been running and saw the nearest door. Maybe he thought he could enter the house and escape through the back. Maybe he knew the police were close and wanted somewhere to hide. I will never know. The most frightening thought is what might have happened if my brother had not closed the door so quickly. What if he had asked the man to come inside? What if he had stepped away from the door for a moment? The stranger might have entered the house. The police may have followed him inside. The gunshots could have happened in the hallway or living room instead of outside. Our family could have been caught between the man and the officers. The stranger may have taken someone hostage or hurt one of us. None of that happened, but it was possible. My brother's quick decision may have protected everyone in the house. I often wonder whether he realized how important that moment was. He simply saw a stranger, felt uneasy, and shut the door. That small action may have prevented the situation from becoming much worse. The memory affected me as I grew older. Unexpected knocks made me nervous. Whenever someone came to the door, especially at night, I wanted to know who it was before opening it. I became more careful about looking through windows or checking who was outside. The sound of fireworks or a car backfiring could also bring the memory back. For a split second, the sharp sound would remind me of crouching down inside my grandmother's house. I would remember being told to stay away from the windows. Then I would remember looking anyway. The image of the body stayed with me most strongly. I do not remember seeing a large amount of blood. Maybe there was blood and my mind blocked it out. Maybe I was too far away to see it clearly. What I remember is the man's stillness. He was lying on the ground while the officer searched him. Living people move, breathe, turn their heads, or react when someone touches them. This man did nothing. That stillness told me everything. Later, my father told me that the police officer who shot the man had been deeply affected by what happened. My father said the officer eventually went insane because of the guilt. I do not know exactly what he meant. Maybe the officer developed serious mental health problems. Maybe he suffered from depression, trauma, or post-traumatic stress. People sometimes say someone went insane when they do not have the correct words to describe what really happened. I never met the officer, and I never heard his side of the story. Still, knowing that he may have struggled with guilt made the event even sadder. When I was 5, I believed police officers were strong people who stopped criminals and then returned to normal life. I did not understand that shooting someone could stay in an officer's mind forever. Even if the officer had no other choice, he still had to live with the fact that he had ended another person's life. Maybe he replayed the shooting again and again. Maybe he wondered whether he could have done something differently. Maybe he saw the man's face in his dreams. The stranger died, but the event may have continued destroying the officer from the inside. That taught me something important. Violence does not always end when the sound of gunfire stops. The effects continue. They remain in the people who were involved, the people who witnessed it, and the families of those who died. The dead man may have had parents, children, brothers, sisters, or a partner. Somewhere, someone may have received the news that he had been shot. To me, he was only an unknown man at the door. To somebody else, he may have been family. I know nothing about who he was before that day. I do not know whether he was a dangerous criminal or a frightened man making terrible choices. I do not know whether he had a weapon. I do not know what caused the officer to fire. I only saw the final result. As I grew older, I tried to understand the event in a more realistic way. The police officer probably believed the man was an immediate threat. Officers do not normally shoot someone without a reason, especially in a public place near homes. Maybe the man had pointed a weapon. Maybe he was running towards someone. Maybe he ignored orders to stop. There could have been many details that a 5-year-old would never have understood. I do not blame the officer, because I do not know enough about what happened. I also cannot say whether the stranger deserved to die. All I can say is that I saw him alive and then saw him dead. That simple fact was enough to stay with me. The event also made me think differently about curiosity. I had been told to stay away from the windows. If I had listened, I might never have seen the body. The memory might have become a vague childhood story about hearing gunshots near my grandmother's home. Instead, I looked outside and saw the truth. For a long time, part of me wished I had not gone to the window. I wondered whether the image would have stayed with me if I had remained on the floor. But another part of me knows I would have always wondered what happened. At 5 years old, I wanted an answer. I got one, but it was an answer I was not prepared to see. The stranger had not disappeared. He had not run away. He was dead. Families sometimes avoid speaking about frightening events after they happen. They believe children will forget if nobody brings it up. I do not remember my family discussing it often. Life continued. We visited my grandmother again. People knocked on doors. Police cars passed through neighborhoods. But the memory stayed inside me. Children may not understand trauma in the same way adults do, but they still carry it. I was not physically hurt. No bullet entered the house. The stranger never touched me. But I heard the gunshots and saw the result. That was enough. Sometimes I wondered whether the man knew children were inside the house when he knocked. Did he see my brother and decide not to push his way in? Did my brother close the door too fast for him to react? Maybe the stranger could have forced his way inside, but chose not to. If that is true, then even in the middle of whatever dangerous situation he was involved in, he may have made one choice that protected us. There is no way to know. The whole incident was made of quick decisions. The man decided to knock on our door. My brother decided to close it. The police officer decided to fire. I decided to look through the window. Each decision lasted only seconds, but the results lasted much longer. The officer may have carried guilt for years. The man lost his life. I carried the memory into adulthood. That is what makes the story frightening to me. There was nothing supernatural about it. No ghost appeared at the window. No strange voice spoke in the night. There was no curse or haunted house. The horror came from how real and sudden it was. A normal day at my grandmother's house changed in minutes. A stranger knocked. Gunshots followed. Then a body lay outside. Real danger does not always announce itself. Sometimes it begins with an ordinary sound at the door. A person opens it, sees someone unfamiliar, and closes it again. A few minutes later, everything changes. Even now, I am careful when someone knocks unexpectedly. I want to know who is standing outside before I open the door. Part of that is common sense, but part of it comes from what happened when I was 5. I remember my brother opening the door and seeing a man none of us knew. I remember how quickly he closed it. I remember the gunshots. I remember crouching down and moving away from the windows. Then I remember ignoring the warning and looking outside. The police officer was searching the body. The man was still. I recognized him. He was the stranger from the door. That moment stayed with me because it connected life and death in the clearest possible way. There was almost no time between them. He had been alive close enough to speak to my brother. Then he was gone. I still do not know why he came to my grandmother's house or what crime had led the police to him. I do not know whether my father's story about the officer was completely accurate. Maybe the officer struggled with guilt. Maybe he suffered from trauma for reasons people around him did not fully understand. Whatever the truth was, the shooting affected more than one person. It affected the man who died. It affected the officer who fired. It affected the family inside the nearby house. And it affected a 5-year-old child who looked out of a window and saw something he could never completely forget. Years have passed, but the memory remains simple and clear. A knock, a stranger, a closed door, gunshots, then a body outside. I was young, but I understood enough to know that something terrible had happened. And even now, I still remember the man who knocked on my grandmother's door only minutes before he died. I took LSD because I wanted to expand my mind. I wanted to experience something deeper than ordinary life and see the world from a new point of view. Instead, I opened a door inside my mind that I could not close. When I left home for university, it was the first time in my life that I had real freedom. My parents had always been protective, and while I lived with them, there were rules about where I could go, who I could spend time with, and what I could do. At university, no one was checking what time I came home. No one was asking where I had been or whether I had finished my work. For the first time, I could make my own choices. That freedom felt exciting. I met new people quickly. Everyone seemed eager to try new things, stay out late, and enjoy being away from home. We drank, went to parties, missed sleep, and behaved as if nothing bad could happen to us. Before university, I had smoked cannabis a few times. I was not a complete stranger to drugs, but I was still inexperienced. Cannabis had made me feel relaxed, and sometimes made ordinary things seem funnier or more interesting. I had never experienced anything that felt truly frightening. Because of that, I believed I understood drugs better than I actually did. A few friends and I began talking about psychedelic drugs. We had heard people describe LSD as something powerful and meaningful. Some said it allowed them to understand themselves better. Others claimed it changed the way they saw life, art, nature, and human relationships. It did not sound like a normal party drug. It sounded like an experience. We wanted to know what it felt like, so we began asking around. Eventually, we found someone who could get it for us. I remember feeling nervous before taking it for the first time, But I was also excited. My friends were there, and we all planned to do it together. I believed that made the situation safe. We took the LSD and waited. At first, nothing happened. We laughed nervously and wondered whether we had been given something fake. Then the room began to change. The walls seemed to move gently, almost as if they were breathing. Colors became stronger and brighter. Patterns appeared in ordinary surfaces. Music sounded deeper than it ever had before, and every note seemed to have a meaning. I felt connected to everything around me. My friends no longer seemed like separate people. It felt as if all of us were part of the same mind. I looked at my hands and became fascinated by the movement of my fingers. I stared at the ceiling and believed I could see endless shapes forming inside it. The experience felt beautiful. It also felt important. I believed I had discovered something that ordinary people could not understand. Everyday life suddenly seemed narrow and dull compared with what I was feeling. For hours, I laughed, talked, and experienced thoughts that seemed incredibly deep at the time. I cannot remember most of those thoughts now, but during the trip, they felt like answers to questions I had never known how to ask. When the effects finally faded, I felt exhausted, but I also felt changed. I could not believe I had gone so long without experiencing anything like it. That first trip became one of the most important moments of my university life. I talked about it constantly. My friends and I discussed the things we had seen and the ideas we believed we had discovered. We began planning to do it again. I did not think of LSD as dangerous. I thought of it as a tool. I believed it could help me explore my mind and understand life more clearly. The more I used it, the more confident I became. Over the next year, I took LSD many times. I cannot remember the exact number, but it was probably around 20 trips in total. Some were stronger than others. A few were uncomfortable, but most of them felt exciting. Sometimes I saw disturbing images or became anxious, but those feelings always faded when the trip ended. I began to believe I could handle anything the drug showed me. I knew people talked about bad trips, but I assumed those experiences happened to people who were careless, frightened, or mentally weak. I thought I was different because I had used LSD repeatedly without serious problems. I was wrong. During what became my final trip, I was sitting in a flat with some friends. The setting was familiar. My mates were on the couch beside me, and everything seemed normal at first. As the LSD began working, the room changed in the usual ways. Colors became intense. Objects appeared to move slightly, and my thoughts began jumping from one idea to another. Then, I heard whispering. It was quiet at first. The voices sounded as if they were coming from the couch beside me, where my friends were sitting. I turned toward them. Their mouths were not moving. They looked relaxed and seemed focused on something else. None of them appeared to be speaking. I listened more carefully. The whispering continued. I could not understand the words. It sounded like several people talking softly from a distance. I told myself that someone upstairs must have the television on. The building was not silent, and sound sometimes traveled through walls or floors in strange ways. There had to be a normal explanation. I ignored it. The whispers came and went during the rest of the trip. Sometimes they seemed close, and other times they faded until I could barely hear them. I did not tell my friends. I did not want them to think I was frightened or losing control. We had all taken the same drug, and I wanted to appear calm. Eventually, the trip ended. The colors returned to normal. The walls stopped moving. My thoughts became clearer, but the whispers did not completely disappear. Later, when I was alone in my flat, I heard them again. At first, they were so faint that I could convince myself they were ordinary sounds. Maybe a neighbor was talking. Maybe a radio was playing in another room. Perhaps people were walking outside. I checked the windows. I listened near the walls. Sometimes I turned off every electronic device and sat in complete silence. The whispers remained. I could not understand what they were saying, but I knew they were there. For the first few days, I assumed the effects of the LS had not fully worn off. I had heard that some people experienced strange after effects. I believed my brain only needed more time to return to normal. I promised myself I would not use LS again until the voices stopped. Then, days became weeks. The whispers continued. They did not remain faint. Slowly, they grew louder. At first, they sounded like unclear conversations in another room. Later, I began hearing individual voices. Some sounded male, some sounded female. A few sounded young, while others sounded much older. They did not all speak at the same time. Sometimes one voice was stronger than the others. At other times, several voices spoke over one another until I could not focus on anything else. I began trying to understand their words. That was a mistake. Once I started listening closely, they became harder to ignore. They commented on things I was doing. They spoke about people I knew. Sometimes they insulted me or warned me that something bad was about to happen. At first, I still believed the voices came from outside. I checked the hallway several times each night. I looked through windows and listened near the front door. I wondered whether my neighbors were playing a cruel joke or whether someone had placed a speaker inside the flat. I searched my room. I moved furniture and checked behind it. I looked inside vents, cupboards, and closets. There was nothing there. The voices followed me wherever I went. I heard them at university. I heard them while walking outside. I heard them in shops, on buses, and while trying to sleep. Sometimes they disappeared for short periods, and I would feel hopeful. Then, one would suddenly speak close to my ear, even when no one was standing near me. I became afraid that people could see what was happening. I watched my friends carefully to see whether they reacted to the voices. When a voice laughed, I looked around to see who else had heard it. No one ever reacted. That frightened me because it meant the voices existed only for me. I knew something was wrong, but I did not want to admit it. I was ashamed. I worried that if I told anyone, they would think I was dangerous or insane. I was also afraid that my family would learn about the drugs. For a long time, I tried to hide everything. When a voice spoke during a conversation, I forced myself not to look toward it. When several voices began arguing, I smiled and pretended I was listening to the real person in front of me. It took more effort every day. My university work began to suffer. I could not focus during lectures because the voices spoke over the professors. Reading became difficult because they commented on every sentence. Sleep was even worse. At night, there was nothing to distract me. I lay in bed while voices whispered in the darkness. Sometimes they sounded as if they were standing beside me. Other times, they seemed to come from inside my head. I began sleeping with the television or music playing because ordinary noise made the voices less noticeable. The lack of sleep made everything worse. I became paranoid. I started believing people were watching me or talking about me. A stranger looking in my direction felt threatening. If two people laughed nearby, I assumed they were laughing at me. My mind began connecting unrelated events. A car parked outside seemed suspicious. A message from a friend felt like a hidden warning. A professor asking why I had missed class seemed like part of a larger plan against me. I knew some of those thoughts were unreasonable, but they felt real. That was the frightening part. The voices did not feel imaginary. They had different personalities and tones. Some seemed cruel, while others acted friendly. A few gave advice. Over time, I began listening to them. At first, I only answered them silently. Later, I sometimes whispered responses when I believed no one was nearby. The voices began telling me how to behave. They told me when to leave a room, when to remain silent, and which people I should avoid. Sometimes they warned me not to eat certain food or not to answer the phone. Following their instructions made me feel safer for a while. I believed that if I listened, they might stop threatening me. Instead, they gained more control. This continued for almost a year. I lived inside a private nightmare while trying to appear normal to everyone around me. My friends noticed changes. I stopped attending social events. I became quiet and distracted. Sometimes I answered questions strangely because I had been listening to a voice instead of the person speaking to me. My family also became concerned. When they asked what was wrong, I said I was stressed because of university. I told them I was tired or depressed. Those things were true, but they were not the whole truth. I was terrified that admitting I heard voices would destroy my life. In the end, hiding it caused even more damage. The voices became so strong that I could no longer behave normally. I followed their instructions in front of other people. I reacted to things no one else could hear. The illness I had tried to hide became obvious. Eventually, I broke down. I was taken to a treatment center, where I remained for about 2 months. Being admitted felt like losing control of my life completely. I was frightened, ashamed, and angry. Part of me still believed the voices were real and that the doctors did not understand what was happening. The staff asked me many questions. They asked when the voices had started, what they said, and whether they told me to hurt myself or anyone else. They asked about drug use. I had to admit that the first whispers began during an LSD trip. My family's medical history was also examined. That was when I learned something I should have known much earlier. There was a history of paranoid schizophrenia in my family. No one had properly explained it to me before. I had not understood that I might have a higher risk of developing a serious mental illness. The doctors told me that LSD and other psychedelic drugs can sometimes trigger or speed up the appearance of psychotic illness in people who are already vulnerable. The drug may not create schizophrenia in every person who uses it, but for someone with the right genetic risk, it can help push the illness forward. I had taken LSD because I wanted to expand my consciousness. Instead, I may have helped awaken an illness that was already waiting inside me. There was no simple cure. I was given medication and began therapy. The treatment reduced the voices, but they did not disappear immediately. Some medications made me exhausted. Others caused side effects that were difficult to manage. Finding the correct treatment took time. I had to learn how to question my own mind. That is incredibly difficult. Most people trust what they hear and see. If someone hears a voice behind them, they turn around because they believe a person is there. I had to learn that something could sound completely real and still come from my illness. I also had to accept that some of my beliefs were not true. People were not always watching me. Friends were not secretly planning against me. Ordinary events did not contain hidden messages. The treatment center kept me safe, but it could not repair everything I had lost. My relationship ended. My fiancée left me. I do not blame her completely. Living with someone who is experiencing untreated psychosis is extremely difficult. I had become suspicious, unpredictable, and emotionally distant. She had watched me change into someone she did not recognize. I also had to leave university. I could no longer keep up with classes, and my illness had become too severe. Dropping out felt like losing the future I had planned. I had gone to university expecting to build a career and create an independent life. Instead, I returned home to live with my parents. I found work in a factory. There is nothing wrong with factory work, but it was not what I had imagined for myself. Every shift reminded me that my life had taken a completely different direction. For several years, I was deeply depressed. I felt as though I had lost almost everything. My education was gone. My relationship was gone. My independence was gone. My trust in my own mind was damaged. I could not see a future that included me. There were times when I believed my life had already ended, even though I was still alive. I thought I would spend the rest of my years living with my parents, taking medication, and wondering what might have happened if I had never used LSD. Regret became another voice inside me. I replayed the first trip and the final trip again and again. I remembered how excited I had been when the walls began moving and the colors became brighter. I remembered believing I had discovered something profound. Then I remembered the first whisper. If I could return to that moment, I would leave immediately. I would ask for help before the voices grew stronger. But life does not allow us to return and make different choices. For a long time, I hated myself. I believed everything that happened was punishment for being careless. Therapy slowly helped me understand that blaming myself forever would not improve my life. I had made risky decisions, but I had not known my family history. I had not understood that I might be especially vulnerable. I also had an illness. Mental illness is not a moral failure. Accepting that did not remove the consequences, but it allowed me to begin moving forward. Medication reduced the voices and helped me think more clearly. Therapy taught me ways to recognize paranoid thoughts and challenge them before they took control. Recovery was not quick. There was no morning when I woke up and felt completely normal again. Progress came slowly. I learned to manage daily routines. I became better at working, communicating with my family, and recognizing when I needed support. Some days were good, others were difficult. There were times when symptoms returned or medication needed to be changed. There were periods when I felt hopeful, followed by weeks when I believed I had made no progress at all. Still, I continued. I began thinking about independence again. I wanted more than simply surviving each day. I wanted to build a career and create a life that belonged to me. My future no longer looked like the one I had imagined at 18, but that did not mean I had no future. Over time, I became happier. That may sound strange considering everything I lost, but it is true. I stopped measuring my current life against the life I might have had. I began focusing on what I could still build. I have medication that helps me. I have therapy. I understand my illness better. I know the warning signs that mean I need extra support. Most importantly, I no longer hide everything from the people who care about me. Trying to appear normal almost destroyed me. For months, I used all my energy to stop people from discovering the truth. I believed silence would protect my friendships, education, and relationship. It did the opposite. Because I waited so long, the illness became much worse before I received treatment. Had I spoken earlier, I might have avoided some of the damage. I might have stayed in university. My relationship might have survived. Even if those things still ended, I may not have suffered alone for an entire year. That is one of the most important lessons I learned. If something is happening inside your mind that frightens you, tell someone. Do not wait until you lose control. Do not allow shame to convince you that silence is safer. Mental illness grows stronger in isolation. I also believe people should know their family medical history before considering psychedelic drugs. Many young people think LSD is only a strange and exciting experience. They hear stories about beautiful colors, deep thoughts, spiritual understanding, and personal growth. Those experiences may happen. But psychedelic drugs are powerful. They can affect people in very different ways. A person with a family history of schizophrenia, psychosis, or certain other mental illnesses may face risks they do not understand. If I had known about my family history, I would never have taken LSD. The experience caused pain not only for me, but for everyone around me. My parents watched their child lose touch with reality. My friends watched me become suspicious and distant. My fiancée watched the person she loved disappear behind voices and paranoia. I cannot undo that pain. All I can do is continue recovering and use my story as a warning. I understand why people are interested in psychedelics. I remember how powerful my first experience felt. For a while, I truly believed LSD had improved me. But the final trip did not end when the drug left my body. The whispers followed me home. They stayed for days, then weeks, then months. They became voices with ages, personalities, and opinions. They entered every part of my life until I listened to them more than I listened to real people. I took LSD because I wanted to explore my mind. I did not know there was something dangerous waiting inside it. I went into that experience believing I would return with knowledge. In a way, I never completely came back. I had to build a new version of myself instead. That process is still continuing. I work, attend therapy, take my medication, and try to become more independent. I still live with the consequences of what happened, but I no longer believe my life is over. I am building a future, slowly. It may take longer than I once expected, but it is mine. For years, I could not imagine being happy again. Now, I am happier than I believed possible. I have accepted that recovery does not mean becoming exactly the person I was before. It means learning to live fully with the person I am now. The voices took many things from me, but they did not take everything. I still have time. I still have people who care about me. I still have the ability to learn, work, and create something meaningful. My greatest mistake was believing I had to suffer alone. My second greatest mistake was using a powerful drug without knowing the illness that existed in my family. Anyone considering psychedelics should understand that the risks are not the same for everyone. Learn your family history. Be honest about your mental health. Do not assume that because your friends had a good experience, you will have the same one. I believed I was opening my mind. Instead, I lost control of it. I am still finding my way back. This happened in 2012 when a group of us went out to celebrate my friend's bachelorette party in San Diego. We had planned a full night together, and everyone was excited. It was supposed to be one of those nights we would remember for the right reasons, full of music, laughter, drinks, photographs, and stories we could tell later. We went to a drag club called Lips. The place was bright, busy, and full of energy. Music played loudly, people were talking over one another, and everyone seemed to be having a good time. Our group was there to celebrate, so we were laughing, drinking, and enjoying the night. My friend had brought several things with her. As the evening continued, she became tired of carrying everything around. At some point, she asked whether I could take her belongings to my car so she would not have to hold them for the rest of the night. It seemed like a simple request. My car was parked nearby, and I did not expect to be gone for long. I took her things and left the club alone. I did not feel especially nervous when I stepped outside. We were in a busy part of San Diego, surrounded by businesses, streets, lights, and other people. I knew it was nighttime, but I did not believe I was walking into a dangerous situation. I was only going to my car and coming straight back. The sounds of the club faded as I walked away. The music became quieter behind me, and the street seemed calmer than it had inside. There were still lights from the nearby buildings, but some areas between the businesses were darker. I reached my car, placed my friend's belongings inside, and made sure the vehicle was locked. Nothing unusual happened on the way there. The danger appeared while I was walking back toward Lips. As I approached the area near the club, I noticed two men standing in an alley. At first, I did not immediately assume they were dangerous. People stand in alleys for many reasons. They might be smoking, waiting for someone, taking a shortcut, or walking toward a parked vehicle. I continued moving toward the club. Then, the two men began walking toward me. Something about the way they moved caught my attention. They were not walking normally. They were not heading past me toward another destination. Their eyes and bodies seemed focused directly on me. Both men lowered themselves slightly and held their hands out. The only way I can describe their posture is that they looked like people trying to catch a loose animal. Their knees were slightly bent, their arms were extended, and they seemed ready to move quickly if I turned in either direction. That was the moment I knew something was wrong. My body understood the danger before my mind had fully explained it. I slowed down. The men continued approaching. I began walking backward so I could keep them in front of me. If they had been innocent people simply walking down the street, they could have continued in a straight line or moved around me. Instead, they adjusted their direction and kept coming toward me. Their attention remained fixed on me. The distance between us began to close. They were probably about 20 feet away when they started moving faster. 20 feet does not sound very close until someone is coming toward you with a clear purpose. At that distance, a person can reach you within seconds. There was no time to take out a phone, search for a number, and wait for help. I had to make a decision immediately. The alley was behind them. The club was ahead of me, but I would have to get past or around them to reach it. I did not want to turn my back because I feared they would run. I kept stepping backward while watching them. The way they held their arms made me believe they planned to grab me. It looked coordinated, as though one intended to move to one side while the other blocked my escape. I do not know whether they had done it before, but they did not seem confused or uncertain. They seemed to know what they were doing. I moved away from the sidewalk and started backing into the street. That was risky because of traffic, but the open road gave me more space. It also made me more visible to anyone driving nearby or looking out from one of the businesses. The men continued closing in. I knew that staying quiet would make things easier for them. If they grabbed me and pulled me into the alley, the people inside the club might never hear anything. The music was loud, and no one knew that I was in danger. I started shouting my friend's name. Mimi. I yelled it loudly. Then I shouted again. Mimi. I called several times, trying to make as much noise as possible. I did not know whether my friend could hear me from inside the club. She probably could not. But the men did not know that. By yelling a name instead of simply screaming, I hoped they would believe someone nearby was waiting for me or watching from the entrance. I wanted them to think I was not alone. I also wanted people around us to look in my direction. The two men reacted to the noise. They had probably expected me to freeze, remain silent, or allow them to get close enough to grab me. Instead, I was moving into the street and shouting repeatedly. I was making it clear that I would not go quietly. Their plan, whatever it was no longer simple. The men stopped advancing. For a moment, they watched me. Then, they turned away. They walked back into the alley. I did not follow them, and I did not stop shouting until I felt there was enough distance between us. I watched as they reached a truck. They got inside and drove away. Everything had happened quickly, but the fear stayed in my body. My heart was beating hard, and I felt shaky. I kept looking toward the direction the truck had gone, afraid they might circle the block and return. I hurried back toward the club. The lights and noise that had seemed ordinary before now felt protective. I wanted to get inside, find my friends, and stand where there were witnesses. When I entered Lips, the party was still going on. Music played, people laughed, and my friends had no idea what had almost happened outside. That contrast made the experience feel unreal. Only moments earlier, two men had been closing in on me with their arms out as if they planned to catch me. Inside the club, everyone was still celebrating. I told my friends what had happened. I explained that two men had come out of the alley and followed me toward the street. I described the way they had crouched, held out their hands, and increased their speed when I moved away. I told them about the truck. At the time, I knew the situation had been frightening, but I did not know exactly what the men had planned. Maybe they intended to rob me. Maybe they wanted to force me into the truck. Maybe they planned to assault me. There was no harmless reason for two men to approach a woman alone late at night in that way. The fact that they retreated only after I shouted made their intentions seem even more suspicious. If they had only wanted to ask a question, they could have spoken. If they had been walking past me, they would not have matched my movements. If they had been trying to help me, they would not have moved like hunters surrounding an animal. I had interrupted something. I just did not yet know how serious it might have been. A few days later, I saw a news article about a woman who had been raped by two men connected to a truck. The moment I read it, I thought about the men outside Lips. The description was close enough to frighten me. Two men, a truck, a woman attacked. I could not prove that they were the same people, but I believed there was a real possibility. I replayed the encounter in my head. If I had not noticed their posture, they might have reached me before I reacted. If I had turned around and tried to walk normally, they might have rushed me from behind. If I had remained on the sidewalk, they could have blocked me between the buildings and the street. If I had been too embarrassed to yell, they might not have stopped. I began wondering whether the woman in the article had faced the same two men. Maybe they had approached her in the same way. Maybe she had been alone near another alley or parking lot. Maybe they had used the truck to move through the city, searching for someone vulnerable. The possibility made me feel sick. I decided to call the police. I told them about the encounter outside Lips. I explained that it had happened only a few days earlier, and that the men had left in a truck. I also mentioned the news report about the woman who had been attacked. I said I did not know whether the incidents were connected, but I believed the information might be important. I expected the police to ask for my name, contact information, a description of the men, and details about the truck. I thought they might want to know the exact location and time. I believed they would create a report in case other women had described similar suspects. Instead, the officers did not seem interested. They did not take my name. They did not make a formal report. They did not ask me to come in and give a full statement. The call ended without anything being done. I was angry and frustrated. The area where the men approached me was surrounded by businesses. There were cameras around the street, the alley, the club, and nearby buildings. I believed there had to be footage of the encounter. A camera might have recorded me walking back from my car. It might have shown the two men coming out of the alley. It could have captured their movements, the truck, or even the license plate. But security recordings are not usually kept forever. If the police had acted quickly, they might have collected that footage. They could have compared the truck and the men with details from the assault case. Instead, nobody appeared to investigate. The fact that no report was made me feel as if the encounter did not matter because I had escaped. I had not been physically harmed. The men had not touched me. No crime had been completed against me. But something dangerous had clearly been happening. I could not understand why the police would not at least record the information. Maybe the men were connected to the attack in the article. Maybe they were not. Either way, their behavior was threatening enough to deserve attention. For a long time, I thought about what might have happened if I had reacted differently. I had walked to the car alone because the distance seemed short. I had not asked anyone to come with me. I had not considered that two men might be waiting near the alley. That does not mean what happened was my fault. A person should be able to walk one short distance without being hunted. Still, the experience changed the way I behaved afterward. I became more careful when leaving clubs, restaurants, and parties at night. I paid attention to alleys, parked vehicles, and people standing near entrances. I stopped assuming that a short walk was automatically safe. I also learned how important it is to make noise. Many people freeze when they sense danger. Sometimes they remain quiet because they are afraid of looking foolish. I could have worried that I was overreacting. I could have told myself the men were only walking in my direction. If I had waited for proof, they might have reached me. Instead, I trusted the feeling that something was wrong. I moved into a more visible area and shouted. That may have saved me. The men wanted control. My yelling created attention and uncertainty. They no longer knew whether someone was coming from the club or whether witnesses were watching. Continuing would have become much riskier for them. So they left. I still wonder what they thought when they first saw me. Did they notice that I was alone? Had they watched me walk to my car? Did they wait in the alley because they expected me to return? Maybe they had seen our group enter the club earlier and knew some of us might walk outside alone. Perhaps they were looking for any woman separated from her friends. The way they approached did not feel random. They did not hesitate or ask one another what to do. They moved together. One appeared ready to come from one side, while the other moved from the opposite direction. That is why their posture remains so clear in my memory. Their hands were out. Their bodies were lowered. They looked ready to catch me. I also think about the truck. If they had only wanted to rob me, they could have taken my purse and run. A truck suggested they might have planned to force someone inside and leave the area. Once a person is inside a vehicle, everything becomes more dangerous. They can be taken somewhere isolated, away from witnesses and cameras. I was only seconds from being close enough for them to grab. Had they reached me, I do not know whether I could have fought both of them. They were two adult men, and I was alone. Even if I had resisted, one could have held me while the other opened the truck. That possibility still frightens me. The later article made the fear worse because it showed that what I imagined was not impossible. A woman had actually been attacked by two men in a truck. Whether or not they were the same men, someone in the area was capable of doing exactly what I feared. I have often wondered whether the police eventually found the attackers from that case. I wonder whether there were other victims. I wonder whether the footage from the businesses was erased before anyone thought to request it. There may once have been a clear recording of the men following me. There may have been an image of their truck. That evidence may have disappeared because no one made a report. The experience also made me understand how narrow the distance can be between a frightening encounter and a life-changing crime. From the outside, nothing happened to me. I walked to my car. Two men approached. I shouted. They left. I returned to my friends. But that simple version leaves out the part that matters. The men were close. They were moving faster. Their bodies were prepared to grab me. They had a vehicle nearby. I had only a few seconds to react. If I had hesitated, the ending could have been completely different. My friends might have waited inside the club and wondered why I had not returned. They might have gone to my car and found it empty. The police might have searched for me instead of taking a report about two suspicious men. My name could have appeared in a news article days later. Those thoughts stayed with me. I am grateful that my instincts warned me before the men got close enough. I am grateful that I moved into the street instead of allowing them to surround me near the alley. I am grateful that I shouted Mimi's name even though I did not know whether she could hear me. The men believed I was creating too much attention, and that was enough to make them leave. Sometimes survival depends on making yourself difficult to control. They wanted someone quiet and isolated. I became loud and visible. I wish the police had taken the situation more seriously. Even if they could not prove a crime had occurred, a report might have helped create a pattern. If another woman described the same two men or the same truck, my information could have supported her account. A camera might have captured something useful. Instead, I was left feeling that because I had escaped, the danger did not count. But it counted to me. I still remember the alley. I remember the distance between us shrinking. I remember backing into the street and calling my friend's name. I remember the moment the men realized I was not going quietly. Then they turned around, returned to their truck, and drove away. I do not know exactly what they planned to do. I may never know whether they were the same men involved in the assault I read about later, but I know their behavior was not innocent. Two men do not approach a woman alone at night with their arms out and bodies lowered unless they intend to stop her from escaping. That night was supposed to be about celebrating my friend. Instead, it became a memory of how close I may have come to being taken. Nothing happened to me physically, but the possibility has never left my mind. I was lucky enough to recognize the danger before it reached me. I was lucky enough to react loudly. And I was lucky that when the men had to choose between continuing and leaving, they decided to drive away. This happened when I was 15 years old, and even now, the memory still affects me. Nothing supernatural happened, and no real criminal ever entered the house, but the fear I felt that night was completely real. It changed the way I react to dark windows, unexpected knocking, and sounds outside at night. My friend and I were alone at her brother's house. We were waiting for her brother and his girlfriend to return home, so we sat in the living room and watched television. It was around 8 or 9 in the evening. By then, it was completely dark outside. The house was quiet, except for the television, and everything felt normal. The area where her brother lived seemed ordinary. It was not the kind of place where I expected anything dangerous to happen. The street had houses lined up on both sides, but cars were only allowed to park along one side of the road. While we were watching television, I noticed a car pull up and park directly in front of the house. I looked toward it for a moment, but I did not think much about it. Because parking was only allowed on one side of the street, people often stopped in front of houses that were not their own. It could have been someone visiting a neighbor, someone waiting to pick up a friend, or even her brother returning home in a different car. I turned my attention back to the television. A few minutes passed. Then, someone knocked on the window beside the couch. The sound was close enough to make me jump. I was sitting right next to that window, so the knock seemed as if it had happened only inches from my head. I looked at my friend immediately. I must have looked terrified because she told me to calm down. She explained that something similar had happened before. Apparently, some neighbors had gotten drunk one night and knocked on the windows as a joke. She thought it might be them again. Her explanation helped a little, but I was still uncomfortable. Even if it was only drunk neighbors, I did not like the idea of people standing outside in the darkness and looking into the house. I tried to focus on the television again. Then the knocking continued. This time, it was harder. The person did not tap gently on the glass. They knocked with enough force that the window seemed to shake. I looked toward it, but all I could see was darkness beyond the glass. During the day, a window allows you to see outside. At night, when the room inside is brightly lit, it becomes more like a mirror. I could see parts of the living room reflected in the glass, but I could not clearly see the person standing outside. That made it worse. Someone could see us clearly while remaining hidden from us. The knocking became louder. It was no longer the kind of sound a neighbor would make to get someone's attention. It was aggressive, repeated pounding. I told my friend that something was wrong. She still tried to remain calm. She reminded me about the neighbors and said they were probably trying to scare us. I wanted to believe her. Then pounding started on another window. This second window was at the front of the living room, almost directly across from where we were sitting. The sounds came from two different directions. Someone was still pounding on the side window near the couch, while another person hit the front window. That was the moment I realized there had to be at least two people outside. My fear became much stronger. One person knocking could have been a confused neighbor or someone playing a stupid joke. Two people surrounding the living room felt planned. They were not simply trying to get us to answer the door. They were moving around the house and creating noise from different sides. Then flashlights began shining through the windows. Bright beams moved across the living room walls, the furniture, and our faces. The light swept through the room as if the people outside were searching for us. They could see exactly where we were. I remember screaming. I could not help it. The pounding was so loud, and the flashlights moved quickly through the room. The whole house seemed surrounded. For a few seconds, I could not think clearly. My mind immediately imagined the worst possibilities. Maybe people were trying to break in. Maybe they had followed us to the house. Maybe they were waiting for us to open the door. I had no idea who they were or what they wanted. The fact that the car had parked outside only minutes earlier suddenly seemed important. The people in that car had probably been watching the house. They may have seen that only two teenage girls were inside. I looked toward the front door and expected someone to start trying the handle. My friend grabbed me and pulled me away from the living room. We ran toward a bedroom at the back of the house. Her brother owned a German Shepherd, and the dog was nearby. I called for it to come into the bedroom with us. A German Shepherd is a large, protective dog. I thought having it in the room would make us safer. My friend told me to leave the dog outside the bedroom. She believed the dog could protect us better from the hallway or living room if someone entered the house. I did not like that idea. I wanted the dog beside me, but I understood what she meant. If the people outside came through the door or a window, the dog might stop them before they reached us. We entered the back bedroom. My friend tried to stay calm, but I could tell she was frightened too. The pounding continued from the front of the house. Even from the bedroom, we could hear the windows being hit. I told her that the people outside knew we were inside because I had screamed. She said they had already known. They had been shining flashlights into the living room before I screamed. They had seen us sitting there. That answer frightened me even more. It meant the people outside were not checking whether anyone was home. They already knew two girls were inside, and they continued pounding anyway. I told my friend to call 911. I repeated it several times. She wanted to call her brother first, because she still thought there was a chance the people outside were the neighbors. I did not understand why she was hesitating. To me, it no longer mattered whether it was the neighbors or strangers. Two people were outside the house at night, pounding on windows and shining flashlights at us. That was enough reason to call the police. I could not make the call myself. At the time, I only had an iPod Touch. It could connect to the internet when Wi-Fi was available, but it did not work like a normal mobile phone. I could not simply dial emergency services. That made me feel helpless. I depended completely on my friend to call someone. She called her brother. I stayed close to her, listening to every word. She told him what was happening. I expected him to tell us to lock the bedroom door, stay away from the windows, and call the police. Instead, he told her to open the front door. I could not believe it. My friend looked confused too. She told him there were people outside pounding on the windows. He repeated that she should open the door. He told her to trust him. I immediately said no. I told her not to leave the bedroom. Opening the front door seemed like the most dangerous thing she could do. If the people outside wanted to enter, opening the door would give them exactly what they wanted. I told her again to call 911. Her brother continued telling her to trust him and open the door. My friend finally decided to listen. She left the bedroom. I did not follow her. The moment she stepped out, I closed the bedroom door behind her. I stood alone inside the room, listening. The pounding had either stopped or become harder to hear from where I was. My heart was beating so fast that I could feel it in my chest. I imagined my friend walking toward the front door while strangers waited outside. I expected to hear screaming. I expected the dog to bark or attack. I thought about hiding in the closet or climbing out through a back window, but I could not leave my friend. At the same time, I was too frightened to open the bedroom door. Within a minute, I heard laughter. At first, I did not understand it. Then I heard crying. The crying sounded like my friend. That confused me even more. Was she hurt? Were the people outside laughing at her? Had her brother known who they were? I stood there trying to decide what to do. I knew I could not remain in the bedroom forever. If my friend was in danger, I needed to see what was happening. I slowly opened the door and stepped into the hallway. The house was quieter now. The heavy pounding had stopped. I moved toward the front of the house. When I reached the living room and looked toward the front door, I saw my friend sitting on the floor and crying. Standing over her were two people I recognized. They were laughing. For a moment, I could not understand what I was seeing. Then, the truth became clear. My friend's brother and his girlfriend had invited friends to come over. Those friends had arrived before them. Instead of waiting normally or knocking on the front door, they decided it would be funny to frighten us. They parked outside, walked around the house, knocked on the window beside me, then started pounding on another window. They used flashlights to shine light into the living room because they wanted us to feel as if the house was being watched or surrounded. They had planned the whole thing as a prank. My friend's brother knew who was outside. That was why he told her to open the front door and trust him. He knew we were not in real danger. But we did not know that. To us, the situation had been completely real. My friend was crying because of the fear and probably because of the relief. The people outside laughed because they believed the prank had worked perfectly. They had frightened us so badly that we ran to the back bedroom. Maybe they expected us to scream and then laugh once we discovered the truth. But I did not find it funny. I had believed people were trying to break into the house. I had imagined being attacked, kidnapped, or killed. I had been trapped in a back bedroom without a working phone, depending on my friend to call for help. The people outside had watched us through the windows and continued after they saw how frightened we were. That was not harmless to me. It was terrifying. I do not remember exactly what I said to them afterward. I may have been too shaken to say much. The fear did not disappear simply because familiar faces were standing at the door. My body was still reacting as if there were a real threat. My hands were probably shaking. My heart was still racing, and I felt sick. It takes time for the body to calm down after intense fear. The people responsible may have apologized, but even if they did, the apology did not undo the experience. They knew it was a joke from the beginning. We did not. That difference mattered. For them, it was a few minutes of entertainment. For me, it became something I carried for years. After that night, windows in the dark became one of my greatest fears. During the daytime, windows feel normal. You can look through them and see the street, yard, sky, or people outside. At night, the balance changes. If the lights are on inside, people outside can see you clearly, while you may only see your own reflection. Someone can stand close to the glass and watch you without being visible. That thought stayed with me. I became afraid to look out windows after dark. Sometimes I avoided walking past them completely. If the curtains were open, I imagined a face appearing on the other side. I expected a hand to strike the glass. Even when I knew the house was safe, part of me waited for the pounding to begin again. The prank changed the way I checked doors, too. If I needed to make sure the front door was locked at night, I felt nervous approaching it. The front door had a large circular window. That window made me feel exposed. To check the lock, I had to move close to the glass. Every time I approached it, I imagined someone standing outside in the darkness. I worried that a face would suddenly appear. I thought about the flashlights sweeping through the living room and the people pounding only inches from where I had been sitting. Sometimes I would turn on every nearby light before checking the door. Other times I moved quickly, locked it, and stepped away without looking through the window. Even years later, the fear remained. People sometimes say that pranks are harmless because nobody gets physically hurt. That is not always true. Fear can leave a lasting effect. The body does not know the difference between a real threat and a convincing fake one. When I heard the pounding, saw the lights, and realized there were several people around the house, my mind believed I was in danger. My heart, breathing, and muscles reacted to that belief. Learning the truth afterward did not erase those reactions. The memory had already been created. I often wondered what would have happened if we had called 911 immediately. Police might have arrived with weapons drawn. They would have believed there was an active break-in or home invasion. The friends outside could have been arrested or even injured if they made the wrong movement. The prank could have become dangerous for everyone. There was also the German Shepherd. My friend left the dog outside the bedroom because she hoped it would protect us. What if the dog had attacked one of the people? A frightened dog does not understand that pounding on windows is a joke. It may have believed strangers were threatening the house. Someone could have been badly bitten. The people outside did not think about any of that. They only thought about how funny our reactions would be. I also wondered why they continued after hearing me scream. A scream should have been enough to show them that the prank had gone too far. They could have stepped into the light and told us who they were. Instead, they continued. The pounding and flashlight beams became more intense. They wanted a stronger reaction. They got one. For a long time, I felt embarrassed about how scared I had been. Part of me believed I should have stayed calm or recognized that it was a joke, but there was no reasonable way for me to know that. I was 15. It was dark. My friend and I were alone. Unknown people surrounded the house, pounded on windows, and used flashlights to track us through the room. Being frightened was the correct response. The people outside created a situation that looked exactly like a serious threat. I eventually stopped blaming myself. I had trusted my instincts. I wanted to call the police. I tried to get to a safer room. I called for the dog. Those were sensible reactions. The only reason the situation ended safely was because the people outside never intended to enter. If they had been real criminals, the outcome could have been very different. That is another reason the memory stayed with me. The prank showed me how vulnerable we were. We were two teenage girls in a house at night. I did not have a phone that could call emergency services. My friend hesitated because she believed the people might be neighbors. We were uncertain, frightened, and dependent on someone outside the house for instructions. A real attacker could have used that confusion. After the incident, I became more careful about keeping a working phone nearby. I paid more attention to locked doors and covered windows. I learned that if something feels dangerous, it is better to call for help and be wrong than to wait until the situation becomes worse. I also learned that familiarity does not make a frightening act harmless. The people outside were not strangers, but we did not know that until the end. While the prank was happening, they were strangers to us. They were hidden by darkness. Their laughter came only after we had already experienced the fear. Even now, I do not enjoy pranks involving home invasions, masked people, or someone pretending to break into a house. Some people laugh at videos like that. I cannot. I think about the person on the other side, believing for those few moments that their life is in danger. I understand how real that fear can become. That night did not involve a ghost, murderer, or real burglar. Still, I have never been more scared. I remember sitting beside the window when the first knock came. I remember my friend saying it was probably the drunk neighbors. I remember trying to calm down. Then the pounding became harder. Another person started hitting the front window. Flashlights moved through the living room. I screamed. My friend pulled me toward the back bedroom. I wanted the German Shepherd beside us, but she left it outside to protect the house. I begged her to call 911. She called her brother instead. He told her to open the front door. I watched her leave and closed the bedroom door behind her. Then I heard laughter and crying. When I finally walked out, I saw my friend on the floor and two familiar people standing over her, laughing. That was the moment I learned it had all been a joke. But the fear never felt like one. To this day, dark windows make me uncomfortable. If I have to walk past one at night, I sometimes avoid looking directly at it. If I need to check a door with glass in it, part of me expects someone to be standing outside. I know it is unlikely. I know most nights are safe. But fear does not always disappear just because the danger was fake. For a few minutes, when I was 15, I believed people were surrounding a house and trying to get inside. The people responsible went home thinking they had pulled off a great prank. I went home with a fear of windows that followed me into adulthood. When I was around 9 years old, I had a small toy dog that I really liked. It was not expensive or special. It was only about the size of a computer mouse, and it looked cute more than anything else. There was a button on its back. When you pressed it, the dog's tail would move from side to side. I do not remember whether the toy made any other sound. As far as I can remember, the main thing it did was wag its little plastic tail. I kept it because I thought it was adorable. One night, I left the toy sitting on the floor near the foot of my bed. There was nothing on top of it, nothing beside it, and no reason for the button to be pressed. It was simply resting on the floor where I had left it. I went to sleep normally. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke to a strange clicking noise. It was repetitive. There was a short pause between each sound, but it continued in the same pattern over and over again. At first, I did not know what it was. I lay in bed and listened, hoping I had imagined it. The bedroom was dark, and the sound seemed to be coming from near the foot of my bed. I thought about the toy dog. The clicking did not sound exactly like the toy, but it was the only logical explanation I could find. Perhaps the tail mechanism had become stuck. Maybe the button was caught, or something inside the toy had broken. But nothing should have been touching it. I was too frightened to lean over the side of the bed and check. People sometimes say children are scared because they are young and have active imaginations. That may be true, but I am still easily frightened by unexplained sounds now. Even as an adult, hearing a repeated noise in a dark room would make me nervous. At 9 years old, it terrified me. I stayed in bed for a long time. I pulled the covers close and listened to the clicking continue. Part of me hoped it would stop on its own. If it stopped, I could tell myself it had only been the toy settling or some normal sound from the house. It did not stop. The longer it continued, the more frightening it became. I began to cry quietly. I did not want to call out because I was afraid something might hear me. At the same time, I did not want to remain alone in the room. The clicking kept coming from the darkness near my feet. Eventually, I decided I could not stay there any longer. To reach my siblings' rooms, I had to walk down a hallway. The hallway was open to the floor below, which made it especially frightening at night. During the day, it was only part of the house. At night, the open space beside it felt like a dark drop. I could look down toward the lower level, but I could not always see what was there. I hated walking through that hallway alone. I imagined someone standing downstairs and looking up at me. I imagined hands reaching between the railings or a figure appearing behind me after I passed. That night, staying in my bedroom felt even worse. I climbed out of bed and moved into the hallway. I tried not to look downstairs. The clicking became quieter as I moved away from my room, but I could still hear it in the distance. I reached the area near my siblings' bedrooms and sat down in the hallway. I did not want to wake them. I knew I was frightened, but I also felt embarrassed. I worried they would laugh at me or tell me to go back to bed. So I sat there and cried quietly. I thought I could sleep on the floor in the hallway. It was uncomfortable, but the clicking was not as loud there, and I was closer to other people. Eventually, my brother woke up and found me. He had a bunk bed, so there was room for me to sleep there. He let me stay in his room for the rest of the night. I do not remember what happened to the toy afterward. Maybe someone checked it in the morning and found nothing wrong. Perhaps the batteries were removed, or the toy was thrown away. What I remember is the sound. I remember sitting alone in my bed, listening to it continue when nothing should have been pressing the button. That was not the only strange thing that happened in that house. I am glad I no longer live there. Some of the other experiences were less direct. They happened in dreams, at night, or when I was very young. Because of that, I know there may be ordinary explanations. Children have nightmares. People can hear sounds incorrectly when they are tired. Old houses make noises. The brain can create figures when a person is half asleep. I understand all of that. Still, when so many strange things happen in one place, it becomes difficult not to connect them. For several years, I had recurring dreams while living there. They did not happen every night or even every month. Sometimes years passed between them. One dream was especially frightening and returned more often than the others. I experienced 3 different versions of it during my life, and all of them happened while I lived in that house. The details changed slightly each time, but the feeling remained the same. There was always something wrong with the house. In the dream, familiar rooms felt darker and larger than they should have been. Hallways stretched too far. Doors opened into places that did not exist during the day. I often felt that something was following me or waiting just outside my sight. The dream did not need a clear monster to frighten me. The house itself felt aware. I would move through it knowing that something bad was about to happen. Sometimes I tried to reach my family but could not find them. Other times I could hear someone nearby but never reached the room where the sound came from. Each version ended differently, but I always woke with the same feeling of dread. There was another recurring dream that happened only twice. The 2 dreams were probably around 5 years apart. The long gap made the second one more disturbing because I had almost forgotten the first. When it returned, I recognized the place and feeling immediately. It was like entering a room I had visited long ago. Even though years had passed, the dream continued from the same strange world. I cannot remember every image clearly enough to describe it without changing details, but I remember waking and thinking that it had returned. Both recurring dreams stopped after I moved away from the house. That may be a coincidence. Maybe I simply grew older and stopped having the same childhood nightmares. But sometimes I wonder whether the house was the reason they kept returning. When I was younger and had nightmares, I often went to sleep in my parents' room. Being close to them made me feel safe. I would lie down somewhere in their room and try to fall asleep again. But even there, I sometimes saw frightening things. I remember looking toward their closet and seeing monster-like figures come out of it. They were not normal people. Their shapes were wrong, and their bodies seemed to bend strangely in the darkness. They would move from the closet toward my father's side of the bed. I saw them lean over him. Sometimes they stood close to his face, or bent over his chest as though examining him. I wanted to scream, but I was often too frightened to move. Looking back, these were probably sleep-related hallucinations. A child waking from a nightmare can continue seeing parts of the dream in the real room. Darkness can turn clothes, furniture, and shadows into shapes that look alive. That is the explanation I prefer. The disturbing part was that my father sometimes woke with scratches. They were not always small marks. Some looked deep enough that they were difficult to explain. He may have scratched himself during sleep. A rough fingernail, zipper, or part of the bed could have caused them. But when I remembered the figures leaning over him, the scratches felt connected. I did not know whether to tell anyone what I saw. Adults usually told children that monsters were not real. If I said something came from the closet and scratched my father, they would have blamed another nightmare. Maybe that was all it was. Still, the image of those figures bending over him remained with me. I also had an alarm clock that behaved strangely when I was very young. It would go off at random times. Sometimes it rang during the night, even though nobody had set it for that hour. We checked the buttons and settings, but it continued happening. Alarm clocks can malfunction. Old electronics fail, buttons become stuck, and power problems can reset the time. There was probably a simple reason. At the time, though, waking to the sudden alarm in the dark made me feel as if someone wanted me awake. I began to dread the sound. I would look across the room at the glowing numbers and wonder whether the clock would start ringing again. There were also the figures in the hallway. When I was very young, I sometimes saw human shapes walking down it at night. They did not always look like clear people. Most appeared as dark forms moving through the open space. They walked past doorways or crossed from one side of the hall to the other. Sometimes I thought it was a family member going to the bathroom. Then I would listen and hear nothing else. No door opened. No footsteps continued. Nobody returned. I would ask about it the next morning, but everyone said they had been asleep. Again, darkness and tiredness can explain a lot. A shadow from a passing car can move across a wall and resemble a person. Someone half asleep can mistake a dream image for movement in the hallway. But after seeing the shapes more than once, I stopped believing every figure was a shadow. Sometimes it looked too human. The strange experiences did not happen only to me. When my brother was around toddler age, he often had night terrors. He would scream, cry, or wake in a confused state. Night terrors are common in children, so the family probably did not think they were paranormal. One night, when he was about 2 years old, he came running downstairs. He was frightened and said he did not like the lady in his room. He was too young to create a detailed ghost story to impress anyone. He simply seemed scared by something he believed he had seen. My family tried to calm him and probably explained it as a dream. Maybe it was. Children often see imaginary people, dream about strangers, or mistake objects for faces. Still, when I thought about the figures I had seen in the hallway, his words made me uncomfortable. Who was the lady? What did she look like? Was she standing near his bed? Had he seen her more than once? He was too young to give clear answers. The family moved on, but the story became one more strange memory connected to the house. My mother also experienced something she could not explain. One day, she was home alone and heard heavy footsteps on the roof. The house had 2 floors and a sloped roof. It was not a flat roof where someone could easily stand or walk. The footsteps sounded too heavy to be a bird. They moved across the roof with enough weight that she believed something large was up there. She listened from inside, trying to understand what could make that sound. An animal was possible. Raccoons, cats, squirrels, and other creatures can sound much larger when they move across a roof. The house itself can also carry and magnify sound. But my mother said it sounded like someone walking. Step after step moved above her. She was alone and had no safe way to check. Even if she looked outside, the roof was too high to see clearly from the ground. Eventually, the footsteps stopped. Nothing was found. That story bothered me because it happened during the day and while my mother was fully awake. It was not a child's nightmare or a shadow seen at midnight. She heard something large walking above her on a roof that should have been impossible to cross normally. One of the strangest things I experienced was hearing my parents call my name when they were not home. It happened more than once. I would be somewhere in the house and clearly hear my mother or father calling me. The voice sounded familiar. It came from another room, downstairs, or the end of the hallway. Sometimes I answered. There would be no response. I would look for them and discover they were not there. They might have been at the store or even out of town. The voice never sounded like a strange person trying to copy them. It sounded exactly like one of my parents. That made it more disturbing. If it had been an unknown whisper, I could have blamed the television or noise outside. But hearing my name in the voice of someone I knew made me react automatically. I would begin walking toward the sound before remembering that they were gone. There is a common idea in paranormal stories that if something calls your name using the voice of a loved one, you should not answer. I did not know those stories when I was young. I simply thought the house was playing tricks on me. Maybe the sound came from a television in another room. Maybe a neighbor shouted a similar name. Perhaps my brain expected to hear my parents and turned an unclear sound into their voices. Those explanations are possible. Yet the calls were sometimes very clear. I would hear my name spoken in the exact tone my mother used when she wanted me to come downstairs. Then I would remember that the house was empty. I never followed the voice all the way into a dangerous situation. I never found a figure waiting for me. The sound always stopped when I began searching. But each time it happened, I felt less alone in the house. That was the main feeling the place gave me. Even when every family member was asleep or away, the house never felt truly empty. There was always the possibility of movement in the hallway, a sound on the roof, a figure near the closet, or a voice calling from another room. Sometimes, nothing happened for months. Then, one small event brought the fear back. A toy clicked by itself. An alarm rang at the wrong time. A dream returned after 5 years. A toddler complained about a lady in his bedroom. Any one of these events could have an ordinary explanation. Together, they made the house feel haunted. I do not know the history of the property well enough to say whether anyone died there or whether something terrible had happened before we moved in. Maybe there was no dark history at all. Perhaps we were simply a family of light sleepers, imaginative children, old electronics, noisy animals, and an aging house. People remember strange events more clearly than normal ones. We may have forgotten hundreds of peaceful nights and held on to the few frightening experiences. That is possible, too. I try to stay reasonable when I think about it. The toy may have had a damaged motor. My recurring dreams may have come from anxiety. The figures in my parents' room may have been hallucinations caused by waking from nightmares. My father may have scratched himself during sleep. The alarm clock was probably faulty. The hallway figures may have been shadows. My brother's lady may have been part of a dream. The footsteps on the roof may have come from a large animal. The voices calling my name may have been sounds my brain misunderstood. Each event has an explanation. But no single explanation covers everything. That is why the house still bothers me. It is also strange that many of the experiences seemed to stop after we moved away. I did not continue having the same recurring dreams. I stopped seeing people walking through the hallway because I no longer lived near that hallway. There were no more strange alarm clocks, roof footsteps, or voices calling from empty rooms. Maybe leaving simply helped me grow out of the fear. Maybe the new house was quieter and more secure. Or maybe whatever had been in the old house stayed there. I am glad I moved out. I do not miss wondering whether a figure would appear at the end of the hall. I do not miss hearing my parents call when I knew they were miles away. Most of all, I do not miss being a 9-year-old child lying in bed while a small toy clicked repeatedly in the darkness. That experience sounds minor compared with some of the others. Nothing appeared. Nothing attacked me. The toy was small and harmless, but the sound was enough. It continued when it should not have. It came from the floor near my bed, where I could not see what was touching the toy. I sat there crying, waiting for it to stop. Then I walked through the dark hallway alone, because staying in the room felt worse. I sat near my siblings' rooms and considered sleeping on the floor because I was too scared to go back. My brother eventually let me sleep in his bunk bed. That night taught me how frightening a familiar home can become when one small thing behaves in a way it should not. A toy's tail moving is not frightening during the day. A clicking sound from the same toy at midnight, when nobody is near it, is completely different. I still do not know what caused it. Maybe the toy was broken. Maybe something on the floor pressed the button. Maybe the batteries were failing and caused the mechanism to move on its own. Those explanations are far more likely than a ghost. But when I remember the rest of the house, the strange dreams, the figures, the lady in my brother's room, the footsteps on the roof, and the voices calling my name, I cannot completely dismiss the feeling that something was there. Perhaps the house was never haunted. Perhaps all of us only experienced ordinary events at different times and later connected them. That is the logical answer. Still, logic does not always remove fear. I am no longer the child crying in the hallway, but unexplained clicking in a dark room would still frighten me. I still do not like hearing someone call my name when I cannot see them. And if I ever woke to find a small toy moving by itself near the foot of my bed, I do not think I would stay long enough to investigate. Whatever was happening in that house, I am glad it is no longer my home. I was newly divorced at the time and trying to rebuild my life while raising 2 small children. Everything had changed very quickly. I was no longer living in the home I had shared with my former husband, and I was trying to create a new sense of safety and normal life for my children. Money was tight, so I could not afford a large place by myself. I ended up renting a small house with my best friend's sister. We already knew each other, and sharing the rent seemed like the easiest solution for both of us. The house was not especially beautiful, but it looked comfortable enough. It was older, with small rooms, worn floors, and the usual marks left behind by previous tenants. There were scratches near some of the doors, faded paint in a few places, and cabinets that did not close perfectly. None of that bothered me. After the divorce, I did not need a perfect home. I only wanted somewhere affordable where my children and I could settle down. I wanted a place where they could sleep safely, keep their toys, and begin adjusting to our new life. The day we moved in was exhausting. We carried boxes through the front door, moved furniture into the rooms, and tried to decide where everything should go. My children were excited because the house was new to them. They ran between the rooms, looking into empty closets and choosing where they wanted their belongings. My roommate and I were focused on practical things. We checked the kitchen cabinets, looked at the space under the sinks, and tried to work out where we would store everything. The house did not have much storage space. There were a few closets, but they were small, and both of us had brought more belongings than we had room for. While looking around, we noticed one of those square attic openings in the ceiling. It was the type covered by a flat panel that could be pushed upward. There was no proper staircase leading into the attic. To look inside, someone had to stand on a chair or ladder, move the panel, and shine a light into the dark space above. We thought the attic might solve our storage problem. If it was dry and clear, we could put boxes up there. We could store seasonal decorations, clothes the children had grown out of, and other things we did not need every day. My roommate found something to stand on and pushed the ceiling panel upward. Dust fell around the opening. The space above was completely dark. She took a flashlight and raised herself high enough to look inside. I stood below her, waiting for her to tell me how much space was available. At first, she did not say anything. She slowly moved the flashlight beam around the attic. I asked what she could see. She said there was not much up there. Then she noticed something. It was a baby doll. The doll looked as though it had been made sometime in the mid-1980s. It had the old-fashioned face many dolls from that period had, with round cheeks, painted eyes, and stiff plastic skin. It was not in a box. It was not covered by a blanket or stored with other toys. It seemed to be sitting or lying there by itself in the attic. That was strange, but not immediately frightening. Previous tenants leave things behind all the time. Maybe a family had once used the attic for storage and forgotten the doll. Perhaps it had belonged to a child who had lived in the house years earlier. My roommate reached into the attic. She grabbed the doll and passed it down to me. The moment I took it into my hands, it began to speak. Mama. The voice sounded like an ordinary electronic baby doll at first. I jumped slightly, but I was not terrified yet. Many dolls are designed to cry, laugh, or say simple words when they are moved. Some have motion sensors. Others make noise when their bodies are pressed or turned. I assumed my roommate had accidentally activated it when she picked it up. Then the doll said it again. Ma. The second word was slower. The voice also sounded deeper. I stared at the doll. My roommate looked down from the attic opening. Then it spoke a third time. Ma. The word stretched out much longer than before. The voice had become even lower, almost as if the sound were slowing down inside a dying machine. That was when I became deeply uncomfortable. The doll was not speaking in the same voice each time. Every repetition was slower and darker. Mama, ma. It sounded less like a child calling for its mother and more like something trying to copy the word. I held it away from my body. My first thought was that the batteries were dying. Anyone who has owned an electronic toy knows how strange it can sound when the power becomes weak. Voices slow down, music becomes distorted, and cheerful sounds can turn frightening. That had to be what was happening. The doll had probably been sitting in the attic for years. If batteries were still inside it, they would be old and almost completely dead. The movement of carrying it down may have activated the voice mechanism one final time. I told my roommate that the batteries were probably losing power. I turned the doll over and began looking for the battery compartment. Most talking dolls have a small plastic cover on the back or beneath their clothes. The cover is usually held in place by a screw. I checked the doll's back. There was no battery cover. I looked underneath its clothing. Nothing. I checked the body again, thinking I had missed it. There was no compartment, no switch, and no opening where batteries could be placed. I began pressing different parts of the doll, searching for some kind of mechanical device. There was nothing obvious. The doll had spoken 3 times, but there were no batteries inside it. I felt the fear move through me immediately. I almost dropped it. My roommate climbed down and checked the doll herself. She looked over the plastic body and searched beneath the clothes. She could not find a battery compartment either. Maybe the doll had a sealed voice box somewhere inside. Perhaps the batteries were built into the body and could not be removed normally. Some toys are designed that way. That explanation was possible, but I did not want to keep the doll long enough to investigate. All I knew was that it had been alone in a dark attic, and the moment we brought it down, it began calling for its mother in a voice that became slower and deeper each time. I was already under a lot of stress from the divorce and the move. My emotions were exhausted, and I had 2 young children who would soon be sleeping in that house. I did not want the doll near them. I did not want to wake in the middle of the night and hear it speaking from another room. I did not want one of my children finding it and bringing it into bed. The most reasonable thing would have been to throw it away in our regular garbage. But even that did not feel safe enough. I worried that someone might take it out of the bin and bring it back. I imagined a neighbor seeing the doll and thinking one of my children had accidentally thrown it away. I also did not want it sitting outside our house overnight. That may sound irrational, but once fear takes control, ordinary choices stop feeling good enough. I found a garbage bag and placed the doll inside it. I tied the bag tightly. For a moment, I considered putting it in another bag as well. The doll had stopped speaking by then. That should have made me feel better. Instead, the silence made me even more nervous. I kept expecting to hear the word again from inside the plastic. Mama, I carried the bag outside and placed it in my car. I did not want my children near it, and I did not want to leave it in the new house while I decided what to do. I got into the car and drove away. There was a church down the street. I decided to take the doll there. I cannot fully explain why the church seemed like the right place. Maybe I believed that if there was anything strange or evil connected to the doll, a church was safer than an ordinary rubbish bin. Perhaps I simply wanted it far enough away that there was no chance of seeing it again. I pulled near the church and found their outdoor garbage container. I took the bag out of the car. Even though I knew the doll was tied inside it, I held the bag away from my body. I opened the lid of the church's bin and threw it inside. The bag landed among the other rubbish. I closed the lid immediately. Then I returned to the car and drove back to the house. I kept looking in the rearview mirror. Part of me expected to see the doll sitting in the back seat. I knew that was ridiculous. I had watched the bag fall into the bin, and there was no one else in the vehicle. Still, I checked several times. When I reached the house, I felt relieved that the doll was gone. My roommate and I talked about what had happened. We tried to make jokes because joking made the situation feel less frightening. We returned to the idea of old batteries or a hidden mechanical voice box. There had to be a normal explanation. Maybe the doll had a pull string mechanism inside it rather than batteries. The string could have been hidden beneath the clothing, and lifting the doll may have pulled it slightly. Some older talking dolls used small records and springs instead of electronic systems. If the mechanism was damaged, the voice could slow down with each repetition. That explanation was logical. The problem was that neither of us remembered seeing a string. We had handled the doll and searched it closely. There had been no obvious way to make it speak. Even if it had used a mechanical voice box, why had it started only after being removed from the attic? Maybe moving it was enough. Maybe gravity shifted something inside. I tried to accept that. I had more important things to worry about. There were boxes to unpack, rooms to organize, and children to care for. Life did not stop because of one strange doll. But that night, the house felt different. Before finding the doll, the attic had only been an empty storage area. Afterward, I kept thinking about the darkness above the ceiling. The doll had been sitting there for an unknown amount of time. Who put it there? Why was it not packed with other toys? Why had the previous tenants left it behind? Maybe they had forgotten it. Maybe a child had thrown it into the attic opening. Or maybe someone had placed it there because they did not want it in the main part of the house. I wondered whether the doll had ever spoken while it was still above us. The attic opening was near the rooms where we would be living. What if the toy had made sounds at night and nobody heard them clearly? An old house has many quiet noises. Wood creaks, pipes move, and animals sometimes enter roof spaces. A faint mechanical voice from the attic could easily be mistaken for the house settling. I imagined lying in bed and hearing a slow, distant mama above the ceiling. The thought made it difficult to sleep. I checked on my children several times that night. They were sleeping normally. Nothing strange happened. No footsteps crossed the house. No voices came from the attic. The doll did not return. As the days passed, the fear faded slightly. We continued moving in and eventually used part of the attic for storage. I never felt completely comfortable opening it again, though whenever the ceiling panel moved, I expected another object to be waiting in the dark. I shined the flashlight farther into every corner before placing anything inside. There were no other dolls. We found dust, old insulation, pieces of wood, and signs that the space had not been cleaned for years. Nothing explained where the baby doll had come from. I sometimes thought about going back to the church's bin. Maybe I could have retrieved it and examined it properly in daylight. We could have looked up the manufacturer, found the model, and learned how its voice worked. That might have given me a completely normal explanation and ended the mystery. But I never went back. I did not want to open the bin and find the bag. I was even more afraid that the bag would be gone. If it had disappeared, the logical explanation would be that the rubbish had already been collected, or someone had removed it. But my mind would have imagined something else. Throwing the doll away without investigating it left questions, but it also allowed me to move forward. I did not tell many people about the experience at first. I worried they would laugh or say I had overreacted. It was only a talking baby doll. Old toys make strange sounds. Maybe the doll had a built-in battery that I did not know about. Perhaps there had been a small sound device sewn inside the clothing instead of the body. There are many possible explanations. But when I tell the story, I always return to the same moment. My roommate reached into the dark attic and passed the doll down to me. The doll was cold and dusty from being stored above the ceiling. Then it said, "Mama," the second time. The voice became slower. The third time, it became deep and stretched out. "Ma, ma." It did not sound cute anymore. It sounded wrong. The memory is especially disturbing because I was newly divorced and caring for 2 young children. The word mama was part of my daily life. My children called for me when they were frightened, hungry, tired, or hurt. Hearing that word from a forgotten doll should have sounded familiar. Instead, it felt like something in the toy had noticed me. I know that is not reasonable. A doll cannot know who is holding it. A broken voice mechanism cannot choose a person. But that was how it felt. It had been silent in the attic until we touched it. Then it called for its mother while I held it. Sometimes I wonder whether throwing it into a church bin was disrespectful. If it had been only an old child's toy, then I threw away something that may once have been loved. Maybe a child had lost it years earlier. Perhaps the doll had been placed in the attic during a move and forgotten. Its voice may have been one of the last surviving parts of someone else's childhood. Thinking of it that way makes the story sad rather than frightening. But then I remember that there were no batteries. My roommate and I both looked. We turned the doll over, checked beneath the clothes, and searched for a compartment. There was nothing. A mechanical voice box remains the most likely explanation, but I had no idea how it worked. I also never heard the doll speak again after the third mama. It did not repeat the word while I carried it to the bag. It remained silent in the car. It made no sound when I threw it into the church's rubbish. Maybe the old mechanism had finally stopped. Maybe it used the last of its stored energy in my hands. Or maybe it had said what it wanted to say. The experience did not turn the house into an obvious haunted place. We did not begin seeing figures or hearing children running through the rooms. Objects did not move on their own. The attic opening stayed closed unless we opened it. As far as I remember, nothing else happened that was as strange as the doll. That almost made the incident feel more believable. There was no dramatic series of supernatural events. There was only one old object in a place where it should not have been, behaving in a way we could not explain. Sometimes one small event is enough. If the house had been full of ghostly activity, I might have decided fear and stress were affecting us. But the doll was physical. Both of us saw it. Both of us heard the voice. Both of us searched for the batteries. I was not alone or waking from a dream. It happened while we were moving into the house in daylight, or normal indoor light, fully awake and focused on practical work. That is why I never completely dismissed it. Years later, I can laugh a little at how quickly I removed it from the house. I did not research the doll or try replacing its batteries. I placed it in a garbage bag and drove it directly to a church. At the time, that seemed like the only sensible choice. I had children to protect, and a home I needed to feel safe in. Keeping a doll that frightened me would have made no sense. Even if there was a normal explanation, I knew I would never be comfortable seeing it in one of the bedrooms. I would never allow my children to play with it. Every time it fell over, changed position, or made a sound, I would have panicked. Throwing it away gave me peace. Sometimes I still imagine someone finding it in the church rubbish. Maybe a worker opened the bin, saw the doll, and took it home for a child. Perhaps the doll ended up in a charity shop. Maybe it sits in someone else's attic now. That thought bothers me more than I like to admit. I prefer to imagine that the rubbish was collected and the doll was destroyed with everything else. Even then, there is a small part of me that wonders what would happen if I returned to that old house and opened the attic again. Would the space be empty? Or would the doll be sitting where we first found it, waiting in the darkness above the ceiling? I know how impossible that sounds. I watched myself put it in the bag. I drove it down the street. I threw it into the church's garbage can. It never came back. Still, I would not want to check. Some objects feel wrong after only one strange moment. That doll was one of them. It did not move its head. Its eyes did not follow us. It did not appear in another room. It only called for its mother 3 times. The first voice sounded almost normal. The second sounded tired. The third sounded deep, slow, and unnatural. Then it stopped. That was enough for me. I had just begun a new life with my children, and I was not willing to bring whatever history belonged to that doll into it. Maybe it was only a damaged toy from the 1980s. Maybe it used an old mechanical system that did not need batteries. Maybe the change in its voice happened because a spring inside it was losing power. Those are the explanations I use when I want the story to feel normal. But when I remember standing beneath the open attic while my roommate shined her flashlight into the darkness, the logical explanations do not completely remove the fear. A forgotten baby doll had been waiting up there. The moment it reached my hands, it began calling me Mama. This happened on my first date with the woman who later became my wife. It was nighttime. I lived in an apartment in a part of the city people often called hip. There were old apartment buildings, small restaurants, bars, clubs, and places that stayed open late. It was not considered the worst part of town. Most people felt comfortable walking there. Still, it was a city. Armed robberies happened from time to time. People got mugged. Fights broke out near bars. You had to stay aware of what was happening around you. My apartment was on a fairly busy street. There were about 5 or 6 blocks of apartment buildings between my place and the main nightlife area. My date and I planned to walk there. The night started well. We were talking and getting to know each other. Since it was our first date, I wanted to make a good impression. I was trying to seem relaxed, confident, and interesting. We had walked about a third of the way when I noticed 2 men behind us. At first, they were far enough away that I could not see them clearly. Still, something about them caught my attention. They did not look like 2 normal people walking toward a bar or restaurant. They looked rough. I tried not to judge them too quickly. People can look unusual without being dangerous. It was also possible they happened to be walking in the same direction. I decided to ignore them. I hoped they would turn down another street or cross the road. They did not. They continued moving closer. The street was strangely quiet that night. Usually there were cars passing and people walking between the apartments and nightlife district. This time, there was almost nobody. The absence of other people made me more aware of the men behind us. I did not want to alarm my date, so I kept talking as though nothing was wrong. The 2 men eventually caught up with us. One of them spoke. "Hey," he said, "I noticed your tattoo. What does it mean?" He was talking about a tattoo on my upper back. Part of it must have been visible above my shirt. I turned slightly and looked at him. He appeared to be Latino and probably in his 30s. He was around my height, and I am not especially tall. He was much thinner than I was. I had a fairly muscular build at the time, and he looked like he weighed maybe 2/3 as much as me. Normally, that difference might have made me feel confident. It did not. The man wore a cheap-looking black T-shirt and blue hospital scrub pants. The scrub pants were one of the strangest details. I remember wondering why he was wearing them. Had he worked at a hospital? Had he stolen them? Had something happened to his normal clothes? He also had several gang-style tattoos. The most noticeable one was a small teardrop tattoo near his eye. He looked restless and unpredictable. Still, he was not openly aggressive. He was not shouting, threatening us, or standing too close. That confused me. If he had immediately demanded my wallet, at least I would have understood the situation. Instead, he was acting friendly while giving me every reason to believe he was dangerous. The second man frightened me more. He was a heavy white man with a beard and reddish hair. He wore sweatpants and a knitted hat, even though it was summer. His hands remained inside his pockets. He did not look at us. He stood there, staring down at the pavement, almost like a zombie waiting for someone to tell him what to do. The first man seemed talkative and active. The second seemed silent and ready. That combination bothered me. I had the feeling the first man was distracting us, while the second waited for the right moment. Maybe the second man had a knife or gun in his pocket. Maybe he was waiting for his friend to give a signal. My mind began working through possible outcomes. We could get robbed. We could get stabbed. They might force us somewhere. There were many ways the encounter could turn bad. I could not simply run. My date was beside me. Leaving her behind was not an option. I also did not want to start a fight unless I had no other choice. The talkative man was smaller than me, but I knew nothing about his friend. I also did not know whether either of them had a weapon. One knife could make strength and size completely meaningless. I decided to answer the question about my tattoo. I explained what it meant in far more detail than necessary. I was not trying to impress him. I was buying time. The longer I talked, the farther we could continue walking. Maybe a car would come by. Maybe another group of people would appear. Maybe we could reach a brighter and busier area. I also wanted to hide how worried I was. If the men were searching for weakness, I did not want to show any. Surprisingly, I did not feel completely panicked. The fear was there, but it was controlled. I was watching the men and thinking through every movement. My date remained calm, too. I was impressed by how well she handled it. She did not scream, pull away, or make sudden movements. She stayed beside me and allowed me to keep the conversation going. The first man listened to my explanation. Then he pointed toward the teardrop tattoo near his eye. "Cool," he said. "See this one?" I looked at it. He continued. "I got this when I shot a rival gang member in the back of the head with a Tech-9. He said it casually. That sentence changed the entire situation. Until then, I had only suspected the men might be dangerous. Now one of them was calmly telling me that he had killed someone. Maybe the story was true. Maybe it was a lie meant to frighten me. Either way, the message was clear. He wanted me to believe he was capable of murder. I started thinking that being robbed might be the best possible outcome. If he had a gun, I thought he probably would have shown it by then. That was not guaranteed, but it gave me a small amount of hope. Maybe he did not have one. That left the possibility of a knife. I imagined being stabbed. It was not a pleasant thought, but I began accepting that it might happen. A strange calm came over me. I realized I had limited control over the situation. I could not make the men disappear. I could not know whether they were armed. All I could do was keep walking, keep talking, and avoid giving them a reason to attack. I also did not want to look terrified in front of my date. That sounds foolish now. When your safety may be at risk, looking tough should not matter. But I was young, and this was our first date. Part of me did not want her to see me panic. More importantly, I believed the man was watching for fear. If he saw weakness, he might become more aggressive, so I kept my voice steady. The strange part was that he remained almost friendly. After telling me he had shot someone in the back of the head, he continued speaking in the same calm tone. "But those days are behind me," he said. "I'm not a gangbanger anymore. I just moved here from Los Angeles. I'm turning my life around." I did not know how to respond. A man had just explained the meaning of his murder tattoo and then announced that he was trying to become a better person. His words did not match the situation. If he had truly left that life behind, why introduce himself by describing a killing? Why approach two strangers at night with a silent friend keeping his hands in his pockets? Why follow us down an unusually empty street? Nothing about it felt normal. Yet I could not accuse him of lying or say anything that might offend him. "That is good to hear, man," I said. "This is a nice city. There are good people here." I tried to sound supportive. Then I added, "Do you mind if we keep walking? We're meeting some friends, and we're running late." The part about meeting friends was useful. I wanted him to believe people were expecting us. If we disappeared, someone might notice. I also wanted to keep moving toward the nightlife area. Every step closer to other people made me feel slightly safer. I imagined the danger decreasing with each block. One step might lower the chance of being stabbed by 1%. Another step might lower it again. It was not real mathematics, but that was how my mind worked in the moment. The first man did not object to us walking. He and his silent friend continued beside or behind us. Then he asked, "Where are you headed?" I did not answer that question directly. I did not want him knowing exactly where we planned to go. He quickly followed it with another question. "What's a good place around here where I can take my woman?" The shift was so strange that I almost thought I had misunderstood him. A few moments earlier, he had claimed to have murdered a rival gang member. Now he wanted restaurant recommendations for a date. I named a couple of places. I went into detail again. I described the food, atmosphere, and location. None of that information mattered to me. I was still buying time. As long as we were talking, nobody was reaching into a pocket or demanding money. The second man remained silent. He kept staring at the ground. His hands stayed inside his pockets. That frightened me more with every passing second. I kept watching him from the corner of my eye. Was he waiting for his friend to finish? Was he nervous? Was he high? Was he holding a weapon? He gave no indication of what he planned to do. The talkative man seemed unpredictable, but at least he spoke. The silent man was impossible to read. The street remained strangely empty. No useful traffic passed. No group of people appeared behind us. The city seemed to have gone quiet exactly when we needed witnesses. I continued thinking through possible ways to defend us. Could I grab the first man before he reached for a weapon? He was smaller than me. Maybe I could lift him or throw him. If a bus came, could I push him in front of it? The thought sounds terrible, but fear creates extreme ideas. If he pulled a knife and tried to kill us, I would need to act quickly. But trying something like that without being certain could make the situation worse. What if he had a gun hidden under his shirt? What if the silent man attacked my date while I fought the first one? What if I failed to control him? There was no safe move. I had to wait. I had to watch. I had to keep speaking as if the conversation was normal. I also found myself thinking about my date. The men barely looked at her. Their attention remained mostly on me. That made me believe they might not intend to harm her. I got the strange impression that the talkative man followed some kind of personal rule about not hurting women or children. That belief may have been completely wrong. I knew nothing about him beyond what he claimed. Still, the idea gave me a little comfort. If they attacked, maybe their focus would stay on me. I could live with being robbed. I could even accept that I might get hurt. What I could not accept was leaving her alone with them. The first man continued talking about starting over. He said Los Angeles and gang life were behind him. I nodded and encouraged him. I told him the city was a good place for a fresh start. Inside, I kept thinking about the tear tattoo and the story about the Tech 9. Was it true? People sometimes get teardrop tattoos for reasons unrelated to murder. He may have invented the story to create fear and control the interaction. If so, it was working. But if the story was true, then I was walking beside someone who had already killed before. Would another robbery or stabbing matter to him? I also kept thinking about his hospital scrub pants. That small detail stayed in my mind because it felt so wrong. Why was he wearing them on a summer night? What had happened to the clothes he wore earlier? Had he left a hospital? Had he changed after committing something? Was he wearing whatever he could find? Fear makes the mind focus on odd details. His clothes became almost as disturbing as his words. The conversation continued for several minutes. It felt much longer. Each second contained several thoughts. I watched his hands. I watched the silent man's pockets. I listened for cars. I measured the distance to the brighter part of the street. I thought about how quickly I could move if something happened. At the same time, I continued discussing restaurants. It was one of the strangest conversations of my life. Part of me wanted the man to reveal his true purpose. Was he going to rob us or not? The uncertainty became exhausting. A direct demand for money would at least give me a clear problem. I could hand over my wallet and hope they left. Instead, he kept talking. That made me wonder whether robbery had never been the goal. Maybe he was lonely and truly wanted conversation. Maybe he had poor social skills and believed telling a murder story made him interesting. Maybe he was trying to scare us for entertainment. Maybe he was testing whether we would show fear. The possibilities did not make me feel safer. A person could be friendly 1 second and violent the next. Finally, the first man seemed to decide the interaction was over. Perhaps he realized we were getting too close to the busier area. Maybe the chance to rob us had passed. Maybe he had genuinely received enough restaurant advice. He said they needed to leave. Then, the two men went in another direction. I watched them move away. I did not immediately relax. I expected them to turn around, follow us again, or pull a weapon from a distance. They continued walking. Eventually, they disappeared. My date and I kept moving toward the nightlife area. Only after we reached more people and brighter lights did I begin to feel safe. The fear did not hit me all at once. During the encounter, I had been strangely calm. Afterward, I began to understand how bad the situation could have become. We had been alone on a quiet street with two men who appeared dangerous. One claimed to have murdered someone. The other kept his hands hidden and never spoke. They followed us and controlled the conversation. We had no idea whether they were armed. There were no witnesses nearby. If they had attacked us, help might not have arrived in time. I was not a tough or fearless person. I did not walk away thinking I had handled the situation like some kind of hero. I had been scared. I simply did not show it as much as I expected. Fear can behave in strange ways. Sometimes people freeze or panic. Sometimes the mind becomes very clear. You recognize that the worst may happen, and once you accept that possibility, part of the fear loses its power. I had reached a point where I believed I might be stabbed. That thought was terrible, but it also simplified things. I could not control whether they had weapons. I could control my voice, body language, and attention. I could stay beside my date. I could avoid insulting them. I could keep us moving toward people. Accepting the danger helped me focus. The strangest part was how polite the whole encounter remained. There was no shouted threat. Nobody demanded my wallet. No weapon was shown. The man asked about a tattoo, discussed murder, claimed to be rebuilding his life, and requested date night recommendations. Then, he left. If I described only the words, it might sound like an unusual conversation with a troubled stranger. The fear came from everything surrounding those words. The empty street, the way the men followed us, the gang tattoos, the teardrop, the scrub pants, the silent friend with hidden hands, the mention of shooting someone in the back of the head. All those details told me the situation could turn violent at any moment. I have wondered what the men were actually doing. Maybe they intended to rob us and changed their minds because I stayed calm. Maybe they thought we were too close to other people by the end. Maybe my claim that friends were waiting made them nervous. Perhaps they saw that I was physically larger than the first man and decided it was not worth the risk. Or maybe they never planned to rob us. The first man may truly have been trying to start conversations in a new city. If that was the case, he had chosen the worst possible introduction. I also wondered whether the second man was as frightening as he appeared. He may have been shy, exhausted, drunk, or mentally unwell. Maybe his hands stayed in his pockets because he was cold, even though it was summer. Perhaps he stared at the ground because he did not want to be involved in the conversation. But in that moment, his silence made him seem like the more dangerous one. He felt like the person who would act if his friend gave the order. My date and I continued the evening. I do not remember whether we talked about the encounter immediately or tried to move past it. Since she later became my wife, the situation did not ruin the date. In a strange way, it may have shown both of us something about the other person. She saw that I would not leave her behind. I saw that she could remain calm during a frightening situation. That is not the kind of first date experience anyone plans, but it became part of our story. For a long time afterward, I thought about the choice not to run. If I had been alone, I might have crossed the street or moved faster as soon as I noticed the men. With my date beside me, I felt responsible for staying with her. Running could also have triggered a chase. Predatory people sometimes react to fear and movement. By staying calm and speaking normally, I may have prevented the men from feeling they had control. I also learned that looking confident and feeling confident are not the same. My voice sounded steady. Inside, I was imagining knives, guns, and buses. I was calculating whether I could throw a man into traffic. I was preparing myself for pain. People sometimes think courage means not being afraid. I do not believe that anymore. Courage can mean recognizing fear and continuing to think clearly. I did not feel powerful. I felt trapped. But I kept us moving. The encounter taught me to pay attention to groups of people approaching from behind, especially at night. It taught me not to ignore my instincts simply because someone has not made an obvious threat. Danger does not always begin with a weapon. Sometimes it begins with a friendly question. A stranger asks about a tattoo. You answer politely. Then he tells you he once shot a man in the back of the head. At that point, you realize you are no longer having a normal conversation. You are trying to survive an unpredictable one. I still do not know whether we were ever truly going to be robbed or attacked. Maybe the danger existed only in my mind. But the fear was based on real warning signs. The men chose to approach us. They stayed with us while we walked. One used a murder story to establish that he was violent. The other remained silent with his hands hidden. That was enough to take seriously. I am grateful the situation ended without violence. Nobody lost money. Nobody was stabbed. My date was unharmed. The two men eventually walked away. Still, I remember the calm acceptance I felt when I believed I might be hurt. It was almost freeing. Once I accepted the worst possibility, I stopped wasting energy wishing the situation were different. I focused on the choices still available to me. Keep walking. Keep talking. Do not show fear. Do not give exact information. Stay beside my date. Reach the lights. It worked. Whether the men changed their minds or never planned anything at all, we reached safety. That first date could have become a tragedy. Instead, it became one of the strangest stories from the beginning of my relationship with the woman I married. Even now, I sometimes think about the man's final questions. After describing a gang murder, he wanted to know where he should take his woman for dinner. I gave him recommendations. Then he and his silent friend disappeared into the night. Fear is strange. Sometimes it screams. Sometimes it freezes you. And sometimes it makes you politely explain the best restaurants in the neighborhood while wondering whether the man beside you is about to stab you. My cousin Chrissy was the person who first made me love horror. She is gone now. She was killed years later by an impaired driver. And even writing that still feels wrong. Some people leave such a strong mark on your life that it becomes difficult to accept they are no longer here. Chrissy was one of those people for me. She was fearless, funny, and always ready to do something that made the rest of us nervous. When we were children, she introduced me to the excitement of being scared on purpose. She taught me that fear could be fun when you knew you were safe. It could make your heart race, make your hands shake, and leave you laughing once the danger passed. That feeling stayed with me. Even now, I love anything that brings a rush of adrenaline. I have always enjoyed fast motorcycles and cars. I joined the Air Force almost on impulse. Later, I became a driving instructor, which is its own special kind of daily terror when you are sitting beside a new driver who has not yet learned the difference between the brake and the accelerator. I still love haunted theme parks, scary movies, and anything designed to make me jump. I owe a lot of that to Chrissy. Whenever I watch a horror movie or walk through a haunted attraction, I think about her. I remember how she could scare me without even trying very hard. She always seemed braver than I was, and I am not embarrassed to admit that I usually lost any challenge involving fear. The memory that stands out most happened when she was 13 and I was 10. We were at my parents' house, which had the kind of basement children should probably not be allowed to explore alone. Some families have clean, finished basements with carpet, comfortable furniture, and a television. Ours was not like that. Ours was what people jokingly call a murder basement. It was old, cold, and partly unfinished. One side had walls and a rough concrete floor, but the other side was almost nothing except exposed earth and dirt. The ground looked as if the house had simply been built over a piece of the land without anyone bothering to finish it properly. The basement smelled damp all the time. There was a mixture of dust, soil, old wood, and cold stone in the air. Even during the warmer months, it felt cooler down there than the rest of the house. The stairs were narrow and made noise whenever someone stepped on them. They led down into darkness, and there was only one light at the bottom. It was a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. A short pull string hung from it. To turn on the light, someone had to walk all the way down the stairs, reach upward, and pull the string. That meant you had to enter the darkness before you could create any light. To a 10-year-old who already had a strong imagination, that basement was perfect for horror. Every shadow looked like a person. The exposed dirt made it easy to imagine that something had been buried beneath the house. The unfinished side seemed to continue farther into the darkness than it really did. There were old boxes, tools, pieces of furniture, and objects that had been forgotten by the adults. During the day, most of those things looked harmless. At night, they changed. A hanging coat became a body. A stack of boxes looked like a crouching person. Pipes along the ceiling seemed like long arms reaching through the room. Chrissy loved it. One evening, we decided to go down there and tell each other scary stories. The idea was simple. We would sit in the basement, take turns telling the most frightening stories we could think of, and see which one of us could remain there the longest. There was no real prize. The winner would only have the satisfaction of knowing they were braver. That was enough for us. I already knew how it would probably end. Chrissy would tell some terrible story about a ghost, murderer, or creature hiding in the dirt. I would try to pretend it did not bother me. Then a pipe would knock, or the house would creak, and I would run upstairs. Chrissy would follow, while laughing at me. That had happened in one form or another many times. She was 3 years older, which felt like a large difference at that age. She had more confidence and a better ability to hide her fear. I was 10 and still very easy to frighten. I could watch a scary movie during the day and tell everyone it did not bother me. Then I would lie awake that night, staring at the closet door and wondering whether something had moved inside it. Chrissy knew that. She also knew exactly how to use it against me. That evening, we stood at the top of the basement stairs. The door was open, and the darkness below seemed to absorb the weak light from the room behind us. I could see the first few steps clearly. Beyond that, everything disappeared. Chrissy looked excited. I was already beginning to question whether this had been a good idea. Still, I did not want to admit that. I followed her. The wooden steps creaked beneath us as we moved down. Every sound seemed louder because the basement was silent. Step, creak, step, creak. I tried not to look too far into the dark space below. Chrissy moved ahead of me. She acted as if there was nothing frightening about walking into an unfinished basement with no light. I stayed close behind her. The air became colder as we descended. The damp smell grew stronger. I could feel the darkness around us before we even reached the bottom. The light bulb was hanging somewhere just ahead, but I could not see it clearly. I knew Chrissy would have to find the string by touch. We reached the final step. The concrete floor felt solid beneath my feet. For one moment, we stood together in complete darkness. The rest of the house seemed far away. I could no longer see the open door at the top of the stairs. I only knew it was behind us. I heard Chrissy shifting beside me. She raised one hand and searched for the pull string. I imagined something else reaching for her from the darkness. That was how my mind worked. Even before anything happened, I was already creating monsters. Then, her fingers found the string. She pulled it. Most people hearing this story probably expect the bulb to flicker once and then go dark. That would have been frightening enough. But that was not what happened. The light bulb exploded. It did not simply burn out. There was a sudden, violent pop directly above us. For the smallest fraction of a second, the bulb flashed bright enough for me to see the basement around us. Then, glass flew through the air. The room returned to total darkness. At exactly the same moment, Chrissy screamed. I had heard her pretend to be scared before. She often screamed during movies or games just to make me react. This scream was different. It was real. The explosion, the flying glass, and Chrissy's voice all happened at once. My body reacted before my mind understood what had occurred. I turned toward the stairs. Chrissy did the same. For two children who had planned to prove how brave they were, we forgot the entire contest immediately. Neither of us cared who reached the top first. We only wanted to escape the basement. We ran into each other trying to reach the stairs. I remember hands, elbows, and feet moving in the darkness. We were both trying to get ahead while also using the other person to find the way. Someone stepped on someone else. One of us may have pushed the other. Neither of us apologized. The basement was now completely dark, and pieces of broken glass were somewhere around our feet. We did not stop to think about that. We found the first step and started climbing. I had never moved so quickly in my life. The stairs were narrow, and we were both fighting to go up at the same time. Chrissy had longer legs and was stronger, but fear gave me more speed than I usually had. We bumped into the walls and each other. The old steps creaked and shook beneath us. I was certain something was behind us. There was no reason to believe that. The bulb had exploded because of some electrical or mechanical problem. But in that moment, logic did not exist. The basement had gone dark after a violent explosion, and my cousin had screamed. My mind immediately decided that something terrible had caused it. I expected a hand to grab my ankle. I expected to hear footsteps coming after us. I imagined a face appearing below the stairs in the brief light from the doorway. Nothing followed us. We reached the top and nearly fell through the basement door together. Once we were back in the light, we slammed the door closed. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. We were breathing hard, our hearts were racing, and our eyes were wide. Then we looked at each other. That was when the fear turned into laughter. It always did with Chrissy. The moment we knew we were safe, the whole experience became funny. We laughed at how quickly we had abandoned the challenge. We laughed about the way we had fought to get up the stairs. Each of us blamed the other for pushing. I probably accused her of stepping on me. She probably reminded me that I had nearly climbed over her to escape. I do not remember which one of us reached the top first. It did not matter. The contest had no winner. The basement had defeated both of us. Eventually, we told the adults what happened. Someone had to go downstairs with a flashlight and inspect the damage. I was not volunteering. Even with an adult nearby, I did not want to return immediately. The broken bulb had scattered glass below it. The remaining part was still attached to the hanging fixture. The adults probably explained that bulbs sometimes burst because of electrical problems, temperature changes, or damage. Maybe there had been moisture in the basement. Maybe the bulb was old. Maybe there was a problem with the fixture. There were several possible explanations. At 10 years old, I did not care. To me, that bulb had exploded at the exact moment we entered the basement to tell ghost stories. The timing felt too perfect. It was as if the house had listened to our plan and decided to provide its own scare. For a while afterward, I was afraid to go into the basement. If someone asked me to bring something upstairs, I wanted another person to come with me. I did not trust the replacement bulb. Whenever someone pulled the string, I expected another explosion. The basement seemed darker than before, even when the light was on. The unfinished dirt area looked more threatening. I kept imagining that the explosion had awakened something. Of course, nothing else happened. No ghost appeared. No creature crawled from the dirt. The new light worked normally. Life continued. Still, the memory stayed. Over the years, I have seen many light bulbs burn out. I have heard the small pop that sometimes happens when a bulb fails. I have replaced blown bulbs and dealt with tripped fuses. I have seen lights flicker, dim, and suddenly go dark. But I have never seen another bulb explode the way that one did. That basement bulb did not simply stop working. It burst hard enough to send glass everywhere. Maybe there was a flaw in the glass. Maybe moisture touched the hot bulb. Maybe the electrical current was unstable. I know there are normal explanations. Even so, I have always wondered why it happened at that exact moment. It waited until Chrissy and I reached the bottom. It waited until she touched the string. Then it exploded above us in complete darkness. If it had happened a few minutes earlier, we might never have gone downstairs. If it had happened later, we would have already been sitting somewhere in the basement telling stories. Instead, it happened at the perfect moment to frighten us as badly as possible. Chrissy loved telling the story afterward. I am sure she changed certain details depending on who was listening. She may have claimed that I screamed louder than she did. She may have insisted that I pushed her out of the way. I would have denied both things. The truth is that we were equally terrified. Her scream proved it. That is one of my favorite parts of the memory. Chrissy was always the brave one. She was the person who could sit through the scariest movie without covering her eyes. She could tell stories in the dark and make other people nervous. But when that bulb exploded, she screamed just like I did. For one moment, the fearless older cousin was as frightened as the 10-year-old child beside her. Then we escaped together. That memory became part of the reason I loved her so much. She made ordinary days feel exciting. A dark basement became a place for a competition. A broken light became a story we could laugh about for years. She gave me memories that still feel alive. That is why losing her was so difficult. She did not die in a mysterious or supernatural way. She was killed by an impaired driver. There was nothing fun or thrilling about that kind of fear. There was no moment afterward when we could laugh and admit we had both been scared. It was permanent. She was gone. For a long time, I could not think about our childhood memories without also thinking about the way her life ended. Grief has a way of attaching itself to everything. A scary movie reminded me of her. A haunted house reminded me of her. A fast car or motorcycle reminded me of the excitement she taught me to enjoy. Even a simple light bulb failing could bring back the basement. At first, those reminders hurt. Later, they became comforting. Now, when I do something that brings a rush of adrenaline, I feel connected to her. When I walk through a haunted attraction and someone jumps from the darkness, I imagine Chrissy laughing. When I watch a horror movie, I remember how easily she could convince me to sit through another frightening scene. When I think about joining the Air Force on impulse or choosing a life filled with fast vehicles and unexpected decisions, I know some of that courage came from her. She taught me not to avoid every frightening thing. Sometimes fear is part of what makes a moment memorable. The basement story is a perfect example. If the light had turned on normally, we probably would have told a few childish ghost stories and then gone upstairs. I might not remember that night at all. Instead, the bulb exploded. Glass flew through the darkness. Chrissy screamed. We fought our way up the stairs as if something were chasing us. That night became unforgettable. I sometimes wonder what she would say if she knew I still told the story. She would probably correct me. She would say I was exaggerating how brave I had been. She would remind everyone that I always lost our fear contests. She might claim that she only screamed because the glass surprised her and that I was the one truly terrified. I would let her tell it however she wanted, if I could hear her voice again. That is the difficult part of remembering someone who has died. The memories remain, but you can no longer ask them whether you remembered everything correctly. You cannot argue over who pushed first or who reached the stairs faster. You cannot create new versions of the story together. All you can do is carry the old ones. I still do not know exactly what caused the bulb to explode. I have read possible explanations over the years. A bulb can burst if there is moisture, a damaged socket, excessive heat, a loose connection, or a defect in the glass. Any of those things could have happened in an old, damp basement. The logical part of me accepts that. Another part of me prefers the version where the basement itself decided to scare us. It was our murder basement, after all. We had entered it to tell horror stories. Maybe it wanted to join the game. If Chrissy were here, I think she would prefer that explanation, too. She would probably say something had been waiting in the dirt, watching us walk down the steps. When she pulled the string, it reached up and crushed the bulb. Then, it laughed while we ran. That story is not true. At least, I do not think it is. But it sounds like something she would have enjoyed. Today, I am older than either of us could have imagined during that night in the basement. I have lived through real fear, danger, grief, and loss. I have learned that some frightening things are fun only because we know they will end. A haunted attraction ends when you reach the exit. A horror movie ends when the screen goes dark. A ride ends when the vehicle stops. The fear becomes laughter because everyone is still there afterward. That night in the basement ended the same way. We reached the top. We were safe. We laughed together. I am grateful I still have that memory. It is not only a story about a strange exploding light bulb, it is a story about Chrissy. It is about the cousin who taught me to love fear without letting it control me. It is about two children entering a dark basement to prove who was braver and discovering that both of them could run equally fast when necessary. It is about a person whose influence remained long after she was gone. I have blown many fuses since then. I have seen many lights fail. Not one of them has ever exploded like that basement bulb. Maybe it was only a rare electrical accident. Maybe the damp air caused the glass to break. Maybe the old fixtures sent too much power through it. I will probably never know. What I know is that the timing was perfect. Chrissy reached up. She pulled the string. The bulb exploded. She screamed. Then, the two of us ran for our lives. Whenever I remember it, I still hear that sharp pop and her voice in the darkness. Then I see us pushing and climbing over each other to escape. The fear is gone now. What remains is the laughter. I will always thank her for giving me my love of horror and adrenaline. I hope she is somewhere peaceful. And knowing Chrissy, I also hope she is haunting the hell out of everyone around her.